Today, the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology is holding a hearing entitled the Trump FCC 4 Years of Lost Opportunities. Due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, today's hearing is being held remotely. All members and witnesses will be participating via video conferencing. As part of our hearing, microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members and witnesses, you will need to unmute your microphone each time you wish to speak. Documents for the record can be sent to Joe Orlando at the email address we provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. The chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Our nation is in the midst of one of the greatest crises we have ever faced. As we approach the grim milestone of 200,000 American deaths from COVID-19. In the last few months, we have seen double-digit unemployment numbers, as well as the worst economic contraction since the Great Depression. According to the director of the CDC, we might hope to start seeing positive impacts from a vaccine in the late summer to early fall of next year. Simply put, the pandemic has changed the way we live our lives, and we will continue to feel its impacts for some time to come. The Energy and Commerce Committee has been conducting oversight of the Trump administration's response to this crisis, and this subcommittee is charged with overseeing the FCC's response. As the primary federal agency tasked with overseeing our nation's telecommunications infrastructure and charged with administering the Universal Service Program, at no point has broadband service and the work done by the FCC been more important to Americans as it is right now. For many of us, high-speed broadband has become the means by which we work, live, and stay healthy. In the last 7 months, the internet has become the lifeline we use to buy groceries, see doctors, and interact with the outside world. Zoom has become a verb, and Americans all over the country are connecting over video chat for virtual worship, family reunions, and so much more. In so many ways, broadband has become the glue holding our society together as our nation and the world weathers this storm. But the digital divide is growing as more Americans struggle to pay their bills and stay connected. They are struggling with services that are too expensive, too slow, and which place onerous and expensive limits on their online activities. For tens of millions of Americans who couldn't afford broadband before the pandemic, the digital divide is only getting greater. Schools around the country are in the midst of restarting, and students are clicking into virtual classrooms. But for over 12 million students who lack broadband access before the pandemic, connectivity is piecemeal at best. Low-income students are struggling to learn as what was once a homework gap becomes a schooling gap. For these kids, a lack of broadband is no longer preventing them from doing homework. It's preventing them from accessing the most powerful tool for economic mobility we have, their education. In Pittsburgh, schools have been delayed due to supply chain shortages in getting laptops and hotspots shipped to students, something that's happening around the country. For some students in Pennsylvania, devices won't arrive until November. And while I applaud the heroic work being done by our local schools to get students connected, our approach, like that being taken around the country, is piecemeal at best. Local schools are hosting fundraisers with parents and asking foundations and corporations for help in closing the funding gaps. Schools don't know how kids are going to get connected or stay connected throughout the school year. We cannot depend as a nation on the generosity of private companies to get us through this crisis. We need a national plan and a coordinated federal resources, none of which this administration or this FCC has seen fit to provide. Instead, we have a government asleep at the wheel as our nation and our people struggle and too many people are being left behind. To be clear, though, we are in this position now because of mismanagement and misplaced priorities by this administration and this FCC over the last 4 years. While COVID-19 is a new threat, many of these issues are not. Instead of addressing these challenges and so many others, This FCC has been dead set on removing consumer protections, enabling increased consolidation, and hollowing out programs intended to connect low-income Americans. We need to do better. This FCC needs to do better. And you have the tools and the resources to do so much more. On behalf of the tens of millions of Americans being left behind, I hope you will. And with that, I will yield the remainder of my time to Congresswoman Matsui. You need to unmute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate having this hearing here today. And FCC oversight is one of the principal duties of this committee, and we have much to discuss today. As co-chair of the Spectrum Caucus, I have a firm belief that we are at a transformational moment in the U.S. The policies we pursue and implement today will have a lasting impact on our economy and standing internationally. In the race to 5G and beyond, the stakes are incredibly high. To ensure innovation and job creation that occur here in the U.S., we need an aggressive and concerted effort. That's why I'm working on legislation to establish a wireless leadership agenda. This bill will help ensure we have a workforce ready to build the networks of the future, promote innovation through R&D, encourage more effective use of spectrum, enhance U.S. leadership on the global stage, and close the digital divide. I look forward to working with this committee and the witnesses here today on this bill to secure our wireless future. And with that, I'd like to thank the witnesses for appearing today and look forward to their questions. Thank you. And I yield back.
Okay, Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Latta, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the commissioners for appearing before us today. Really appreciate it. Since the last time you joined us, the communications landscape has drastically changed. Even before we had to deal with the problems that came as a result of COVID-19 pandemic, the communications industry has been one of the fastest evolving fields in our economy for decades. Despite the challenges the pandemic has highlighted, I have been pleased to see the swift, overwhelming response by both the industry and the FCC to address these problems in ways that prioritize American consumers. Chairman Pai's Keep Americans Connected pledge is a perfect example of this dedication, where carriers voluntarily committed to keeping all Americans connected regardless of their ability to pay the bill. By working with, not against the industry and in the public's best interest, the FCC was able to secure connectivity for countless American families despite widespread loss of income across the country, and without the need for heavy-handed regulations. Contradicting initial fears that we would see mass disconnection or sticker shock when the pledge expired, service providers have instead started the process of easing their services back to normalcy, reflecting our citizens' steady re-entrance into the job market. On top of keeping Americans connected to their schools, jobs, and loved ones through the internet, the FCC successfully distributed the $200 million that Congress appropriated through the CARES Act to make sure countless Americans could utilize telehealth to get the care they desperately needed. In my district, this allowed a behavioral health provider to go from seeing 467 patients remotely to over 16,000. Let me repeat that. From seeing 467 patients remotely to over 16,000. An expansion of telehealth at this scale may have seemed impossible only a few years ago, but now millions of Americans are able to see their doctors safely from their own homes. But it's not just the FCC's quick reactions that have kept our communications running smoothly. The groundwork for strong communications infrastructure has been laid by policies that came well before the COVID-19 pandemic. By pivoting away from misguided efforts to regulate the internet the same way we regulated monopolies over 86 years ago, the FCC's light touch regulatory approach has endured, allowing broadband providers to focus on building out infrastructure, providing service to consumers, and offering voluntary programs and community service efforts. This investment in agile network management has allowed our communications network to hold up during these times despite the heavy traffic our systems have had to bear over the past few months. Yet, despite these successes, Mr. Chairman, you've decided to hold a partisan hearing today. We should be here to talk about the ways to close the digital divide and how Congress can help the FCC in achieving that mission. Unfortunately, this partisan approach has become a trend. Under Republican leadership, this committee unanimously passed an autonomous vehicle bill that soared through the House and passed countless other bills to improve broadband access. In fact, 96% of the bills passed out of this committee under then Chairman Walden received bipartisan votes. Today, I hope we can still have a productive conversation about the work that the FCC has done and the ways to close the digital divide. And finally, I do want to thank then Chairman Walden, our Republican leader, for all of his years of work and leadership on these issues. This may be his last FCC oversight hearing, and his work on communications and technology issues led to many of the topics of discussion I'm sure we will hear about today. So with that, again, Greg, thanks for all of your hard work through all the years. I thank our commissioners for their testimony today, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back. And before I do offer for the record 3 documents for the record, and I believe that normally it's the same procedure. They will all be accepted at the end of the hearing.
Sure, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman
Chairman.
yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. Today, we're examining 4 years of lost opportunities at the FCC during the Trump administration. The actions and at times inactions of this FCC have had a significant impact in the lives of Americans, but often not for the better. We're likely to hear from the majority commissioners about their so-called accomplishments, but to me, it reads more like an industry wish list and pandering to the Trump administration that does not seem to care much about consumers. And here are just a couple of the most egregious examples of what the Republican-led FCC did. First, obliteration of net neutrality regulations that protect a free, fair, and open internet, and abdication of their responsibilities to the Federal Trade Commission. Second, near complete deregulation of media ownership rules, allowing big media conglomerates to eat up small and local stations. Third, eliminating environmental and tribal reviews and undermining local authority and protections to give companies the upper hand, even as we all know you can't streamline your way to universal broadband deployment. And fourth, using official government processes to allow President Trump to get back at Twitter for correctly labeling one of his tweets as false. And these examples are concerning, and thankfully the courts have stepped in to halt some of them, but I'm equally concerned about what the FCC under President Trump has ignored over the past 4 years. Rather than address the digital divide created by the lack of affordable broadband, the Republican-led FCC proposed drastic cuts to the Lifeline program. At the same time, we know they used fundamentally flawed data to claim progress closing the digital divide. And even during this unprecedented pandemic, as broadband has been vitally important to reducing the spread of COVID-19, the chairman has not promoted actions to significantly help the millions of families falling through the digital cracks. Most importantly, the FCC under Trump has not extended the E-rate program to cover the digital classrooms in students' and teachers' homes. Students, as we know, are huddled around fast food parking lots to get Wi-Fi connections. And just yesterday, the FCC took action on E-rate, but somehow forgot to let kids with internet or help kids with internet connectivity at home, where many of them are attending school and doing homework these days. And rather than expand the Lifeline program so that low-income Americans could work or attend doctor's appointments from home, the Republican-led FCC asked companies for a voluntary pledge to not cut off customers while allowing charges to pile up. And that pledge ended in August. The FCC has delayed work on network resiliency despite calls from the Democratic commissioners, sitting on the recommendations of 2 FCC reports for 2 years now that will improve the resiliency of communications networks. And those improvements are certainly needed right now as the West Coast faces devastating and destructive wildfires, while the Gulf Coast and the East Coast face Hurricane Sally. It's just a lot of missed opportunities. Even the massive $20 billion broadband deployment auction announced by the FCC is based on inaccurate data. Without proper maps, much of the money may be wasted and consumers left unserved. I just think we have to do better than this. Looking ahead, I believe these are some of the primary communications policies that we must work together to address. First, we must make sure that high-speed broadband is open, available, and affordable to everyone. Second, we must ensure that our communications networks are resilient. Voluntary agreements and industry roundtables are just not enough. Third, we have to secure our communications equipment supply chain from companies like Huawei and remain vigilant to guard against the threats to come. Fourth, we must have a thoughtful, coherent spectrum strategy and stop the interagency squabbles that the Trump administration has fanned. And fifth, we need to ensure that the modern broadcast television and radio industry still reflects our core media principles, and those are localism, diversity, and competition. And sixth, we must hold social media platforms accountable to the public, not thin-skinned demagogues, and discourage the misinformation, discrimination, and violence that undermines our society. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and I look forward to continue our work on these issues, and hopefully we'll hear some response to this from the witnesses that are here today. And with that, Chairman Doyle, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, the ranking member of the full committee. And let me say, Greg, that I think all of us have been watching what's going on in your state and California and Washington, and our thoughts and prayers are with your constituents and the people in California and Washington too. Greg shared some photos with me over the weekend as he was taking a tour in his district, and it's just really sad to see. But anyways, Greg, you've got 5 minutes. Time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your prayers and thoughts for my constituents and others in Oregon and Washington, California, who've been so adversely affected by these terrible, terrible fires. Thanks for the hearing today and the kind comments from Mr. Latta as well. I don't know if it's my last hearing or not, but I've always had a passion for telecommunications issues, as you know, and chaired this subcommittee, so I appreciate it. And as Republican leader of the committee and former chairman of the full committee, this subcommittee, I've always taken our oversight role really seriously. And I got to say, if Twitter's doing a fact check, they ought to fact check the title of your hearing, Mr. Chairman. I think they'd find it's probably false. Sadly, the title of the hearing made clear this would be yet another partisan attack on President Trump. I guess we're in that season. Long on nasty quotes, short on facts. You'd think that when fires are destroying communities in the West and COVID's upending life nationwide, that Democrats could rise above partisan rancor and show America how we can work together to close the digital divide. That should be our common goal. Fortunately, while Democrats on this committee put partisan politics first, the FCC, an independent agency, has done a lot to ensure Americans are better connected. In fact, the FCC under Chairman Pai's leadership has done a lot, period. Right here, I have a list of achievements that spans many pages, Mr. Chairman, which I would ask to be put in the record. There's too many to detail in just the 5 minutes I have. It spans pages, and the FCC has done so much to connect patients and doctors during the pandemic, to close the digital divide, to promote innovation, to protect consumers by stopping illegal robocalls. That's just to name a few. These, Mr. Chairman, are hardly opportunities missed. Is there more work that can be done? You bet there is, and we should do it together. In 2017, Chairman Pai announced his plan to protect consumers while ending burdensome regulations that hinder investment in broadband network deployment and resiliency. This allowed our networks to withstand the COVID-19 stress test, while socialists in Europe struggled to micromanage their networks under burdensome government regulations like Democrats have advocated for here. Meanwhile, we could have been working to expand broadband access for low-income and minority consumers, but the committee wasted 5 months focusing instead on, and I quote, making sure big corporations don't use their power to undermine and silence their small competitors or their political opposition, close quote. I'm pretty sure that didn't happen, at least not by broadband providers. Meanwhile, the farce of net neutrality was fully exposed as little more than a political head fake. In the first 2 years under my chairmanship, this committee ticked off many accomplishments. We reauthorized the Federal Communications Commission for the first time in more than 2 decades with the Ray Bombs Act. We required the commission to increase spectrum availability for commercial use, which the commission has far exceeded under Chairman Pai's leadership, including making an unprecedented 1,200 megahertz of unlicensed spectrum for the Internet of Things available. We required the commission to improve public safety communications, and they did. such as adopting rules on vertical 9/11 location accuracy and implementing Kerry's Law and implementing FirstNet, which, by the way, was used by our first responders out in Oregon. During COVID-19, while Democrats focused on attacking the president, putting politics before progress, the FCC was putting consumers first. Chairman Pai's commission has taken more than 15 major actions to combat illegal robocalls, streamline the Lifeline program so more low-income consumers could have access to phone service, and made over $8 billion available to help rural consumers have access to high-speed internet, with the intention of putting $20 billion out the door through their Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And where there are still challenges ahead, and there are, that require congressional action, Republicans have put forward serious proposals to address these issues, and we would like to work with you across the aisle as we have in the past. In fact, we sent you an urgent letter in July, Mr. Chairman, asking you to put consumers and children first and hold a hearing to close the digital divide. Unfortunately, we've not had that hearing. Meanwhile, the Commission, under Chairman Pai's leadership, has had a busy year acting to keep Americans connected. The Ninth Circuit courts upheld the majority of the FCC's small cell wireless infrastructure order and helped bring our infrastructure siting regulations into the 5G era. The largest mid-band spectrum auction in our nation's history is on track to begin in less than 3 months, and 5G deployment is well underway. And through the Broadband Data Act, the FCC is starting its work to update the maps and push out significant funding for rural broadband deployment. Commissioner Rosenworcel and I were talking yesterday about how many decades have gone by with bad maps and how much we need to get that done. I think back to the Obama stimulus plan where they spent the money before they did the maps, and we're still fighting over maps. I'm glad to see we're beginning to make progress there. Let's get it done. Today, I look forward to celebrating successes of the past 4 years and talking about our efforts to work together to close the digital divide. I'd like to end by thanking my Energy and Commerce Committee alum, Commissioner Mike O'Reilly, for his many years of public service. When we've called, you've come. When we've asked for answers, you've given them to us. You've always been straightforward and hardworking. We appreciate your leadership in every capacity. Your expertise will be missed, and I wish you well in your future endeavors. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair would like to remind all members that pursuant to committee rules, members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. I'd like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. First, we have the Honorable Ajit Pai, Chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. Welcome. The Honorable Michael O'Reilly, FCC Commissioner. Welcome, Michael. The Honorable Brendan Carr. Welcome, Brendan. The Honorable Jessica Rosenworcel. Jessica, welcome. And the Honorable Jeffrey Starks. Jeff, welcome to you. We want to thank all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to your testimony. At this time, the chair will recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide an opening statement, and we will start with our chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's your microphone for 5 minutes.
Well, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, members of the subcommittee, I appear before you to discuss all the FCC has accomplished since January 2017. Let's start with wireless. The prior administration started 3 major spectrum auctions in 8 years. This FCC has held 4 major spectrum auctions in less than half the time, with a 5th scheduled for December 8th. In less than 4 years, this FCC has made far more mid-band spectrum available for unlicensed operations, 5 times the previous total, than the prior administration did in 8. In the last 4 years of the prior administration, the United States added fewer than 7,000 cell sites. But since 2016, the US has added more than 87,000 cell sites, with over 46,000 of them added in 2019 alone. When I became chairman, the US had no commercial 5G deployments. Today, according to Ookla, we have over 7,000, covering over 250 million Americans. From 2014 to 2016, the percentage of rural Americans covered by an LTE network with a median speed of 10 megabits per second stagnated at 70%. By 2018, that figure was over 83%. And according to Ookla, mobile broadband speeds have increased by 99% since 2016. Turning to fixed broadband. During the last 2 years of the prior administration, overall broadband network investments declined. Under this FCC, they've gone up, with annual records set for new fiber deployment in each of the past 2 years. From 2016 to 2019, the number of Americans without access to 25 megabit per second fixed broadband service fell by 45%. And the number of rural Americans with access to 250 megabit per second service more than tripled from 2016 to 2018. And prices have fallen for the most popular broadband offerings, about 20%, according to Urban Rate Survey data. According to Ookla, fixed broadband speeds have increased 164% since 2016. This after some Washington politicians infamously predicted that consumers would get the internet one word at a time because of regulatory reforms in 2017. Turning to universal service. Under the last administration, taxpayer dollars were used to put Huawei equipment in our nation's networks. This FCC put an end to that. Under the last administration, the rural healthcare program remained capped at $400 million. This FCC raised the cap, making $802 million available this year alone. Under the last administration, there was not a single significant tribal broadband initiative. This FCC established a tribal broadband factor, increased funding for tribal operations, and gave tribes a first ever chance to get prime mid-band spectrum for free. Under the last administration, the Connect America Fund auction languished for half a decade. This FCC not only held that auction, but is launching the $16 billion Rural Digital Opportunity Fund next month to bring broadband to up to 10 million unserved Americans. Turning to productivity and bipartisanship, under the prior chairman, the FCC considered an average of 2.7 items per meeting. Under my leadership, the average is now 5.9, and with my transparency reforms, now the public can actually see the items before we vote on them, at least 3 weeks before. Under the prior chairman, over 30% of FCC meeting items were passed on a party line vote. Under my leadership, that's down by almost 2/3 to 11.5%. In sum, this FCC has delivered a lot of value for the American people. And that is a notable contrast with this subcommittee. Example 1, when we appeared before this body on December 5th, 2019, everyone seemed to agree on the need for C-band legislation to fund national priorities like rural broadband. 287 days later, the FCC has set up the auction, and this Congress has enacted nothing. Example 2, on December 2nd, 2019, I called on Congress to repeal the misguided T-band auction mandate. Everyone seems to agree that the auction is doomed to fail, but the FCC is legally compelled to waste resources on it. 290 days later, the FCC has indeed wasted resources, but this Congress has enacted nothing. Example 3, everyone seems to agree that the Obama FCC's broadband maps are flawed. On August 1st, 2019, the FCC voted to correct them. But then the subcommittee cut off the only funding source we had. 411 days later, the FCC has repeatedly requested new funding, and this Congress has enacted nothing. Time does not permit further examples, but I do look forward to answering your questions, in which I hope we can tease out other ways in which we can work together. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you, Commissioner Riley. You are recognized for 5 minutes, and I also want to thank you for your service to the commission and wish you well in your future endeavors. The microphone's yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to join the subcommittee as it conducts further oversight of the Federal Communications Commission. Instead of restating my submitted testimony, I thought it would be more appropriate to make a few points and allow members to get to their questions quickly. Number 1, more commercial spectrum, particularly mid-band spectrum, is going to be needed for licensed services to meet U.S. consumer demand, ultimately win the worldwide race to 5G, and eventually deploy 6G and beyond. Much progress has been made over the last 7 years as a result of my advocacy. However, our nation's still short by about 300 to 500 megahertz, according to experts, and that's excluding the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band. This means that it's incredibly important to push federal departments and agencies to be more efficient, regardless of their recalcitrance. Number 2, expanding broadband availability to all Americans that seek it remains a commission priority, and exceptional work is being done on this front, including Senator Wicker's effort to expedite build-out. Yet much more effort and thought will be required to solve the remaining service gaps. The FCC has a track record and expertise in maximizing the efficiency of its broadband subsidies, and I would caution against attempts to create new federal programs or regulatory bodies to address this matter. Additionally, scarce federal funding should go to those truly unserved areas rather than overbuilding those where broadband service already exists. And all efforts should be made to avoid duplication of USF programs and other federal funding streams. Number 3, fixes are needed to address the Lifeline program's minimum standards, systemic waste, fraud, and abuse, lack of cost bearing by those who buy service in excess of minimum standards, and absence of a workable hardline budget. Without improvements, the political pressures will continue to tear this program apart and hamper its effectiveness. Number 4, the red light services are vastly out of line with the digital transformation of our society and the fierce competition from completely unregulated entities. Fundamental reform hasn't been achieved during my time at the Commission, and our outdated regulatory rules and structural silos unfortunately remain in place. Congress has the power to fundamentally rewrite the statute to reflect today's very different marketplace, and I strongly encourage you to consider doing so. I thank the subcommittee members for your hospitality over the years as I look forward to my next chapter in my career, wherever it may take me. I welcome any questions you may have, and I thank you so very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Commissioner Koch. Recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the chance to testify. Since we last appeared before the subcommittee, the country has been seized by a pandemic that seriously altered Americans' lives. In an instant, everyday tasks that used to be carried out in person moved onto the internet, from distance learning to work to accessing healthcare. The FCC recognized the sudden shifts that the pandemic caused and immediately responded. First, we ensured that pandemic-related financial stress did not cut off service when Americans needed it most. Chairman Pai's Keep Americans Connected pledge opened up free Wi-Fi hotspots and kept families online through job disruptions. We cleared the way for providers to donate tablets so kids can learn from home, waived Lifeline rules, and supported services vital to the deaf and hard of hearing. We also worked closely with providers that launched new programs to connect low-income families with high-speed services. Second, we tracked surges in network traffic and, where necessary, expanded capacity, including through new spectrum moves. Third, we expedited support for telehealth programs. Just days after Congress provided funding through the CARES Act, we stood up an emergency COVID-19 telehealth program. All told, the FCC approved support for 539 healthcare providers. I've seen firsthand the difference this initiative has made. 2 weeks ago in Perrysburg, Ohio, Ranking Member Latta and I visited a provider of mental health services. As COVID hit, they saw an immediate 20-fold increase in telehealth visits. They met this demand with the help of nearly $100,000 in support from the FCC's program. In Michigan, I joined Congresswoman Dingell at the University of Michigan Hospital. With COVID, they saw video visits spike from about 400 per month to over 30,000 a month. FCC funding allowed them to ramp up their telecom infrastructure. I'm pleased that the FCC's initiatives support responses like these, and I'm excited to lead the FCC's work on a separate $100 million connected care program in the coming months. Now, with the increases in internet traffic we've seen, America's networks fared exceptionally well. Other advanced economies weren't so fortunate. Their networks strained to maintain quality and speed, including in Europe, where officials asked Netflix to reduce their video quality to prevent the continent's networks from breaking. America's networks performed because of the private sector's unprecedented levels of investment. In 2018, for instance, America's wireless providers invested over 70% more per subscriber than their counterparts in Europe. In 2019, wireline providers built out more miles of high-speed fiber than ever before. Internet speeds are up, and last year, the U.S. wireless industry invested a record-breaking $29.1 billion in their networks. That's a 4-year high, #1 in the world, and 4 times the per capita investment that China is seeing. And we're not going to stop there. In the first half of this year alone, the pace of wireless builds and upgrades doubled. The number of communities benefiting from high-speed cell builds increased from 3 to 4-fold, depending on the provider. And none of this happens by chance. It's been fostered by the FCC's work to modernize our infrastructure rules. We updated federal historic and environmental reviews that needlessly held back builds. We accelerated construction of small cells by building on common sense reforms adopted by the states. We streamlined the process for swapping out utility poles to add wireless equipment. We expedited reviews for wireless builds that are essential for COVID response. And we clarified our rules implementing Section 6409, a step that will hasten the upgrade of thousands of towers to 5G, including in rural America. The FCC's work to modernize our infrastructure rules enabled the private sector to make America home to the strongest 5G platform in the world. 5G is live today, not just in places like New York or San Francisco, but in Defiance County, Ohio, in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I'm proud of the results that our reforms and the FCC staff's work have delivered. Finally, I want to take a moment to recognize and express my gratitude to the committee's Republican leader, Greg Walden. Since he announced his retirement, this may be his last FCC hearing, as we heard. Congressman Walden has had one of the most consequential runs in Congress. Among his many legislative accomplishments, the Middle Class Tax Relief and Jobs Act provided the reforms necessary for America to lead the world in 4G and now extend that leadership into 5G. His work on the Ray Balmes Act operated not only as an important piece of legislation, but really a fitting tribute to his friend and a lifelong advocate for expanding connectivity. Of course, his work in communications issues started long before his time in Congress, having run a radio station in Oregon, and he carried those experiences forward into Congress, demonstrating a long-standing support for broadcasters and the value they bring to their local communities. So thank you to Congressman Walden for your service to this country. Thank you, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Commissioner.
gentlemen. Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Commissioner Rosenworcel for her opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. Let me start with a picture. There are two little girls on a sidewalk outside of a Taco Bell in California. They sit up straight against the curb, shoulder to shoulder, each with a laptop in hand. But they weren't there for lunch. They were on the concrete by a fast food joint for online class. You see, they don't have internet at home, so they were using the free wireless signal at the restaurant to go to school. This picture, which was everywhere on social media, should light a fire under the Federal Communications Commission. That's because it is our responsibility to bring advanced communications to everyone, everywhere in this country, no matter who they are or where they live. And that mission has more urgency than ever before as we struggle with a cruel virus that has emptied our schools, filled our hospitals, and crashed our economy. That virus has also exposed a hard truth. The digital divide in this country is big, and we need to address it. We need a national policy of 100%. In other words, we need 100% of us connected to broadband, just like with electricity, just like with water. That's because no individual, no household, and no community will have a fair shot without it. We're not there yet. You see it clearly in this picture. You see it in the nearly 17 million kids, just like those two little girls, who fall into the homework gap and can't do their schoolwork because they have no internet at home. We need to stop looking the other way. The FCC should be using the E-rate program right now to help get these kids connected during this crisis, so that no child is left offline. And then first things first, we need a real plan for broadband for all, for rural America, for urban America, for everything in between. We need a plan that tackles both broadband deployment and adoption, because we will never overcome our nation's digital divide without focusing on both. But we have work to do, because the FCC continues to issue rosy reports saying broadband networks are reaching all Americans in a timely way. In fact, just a few months ago, the agency reported only 18 million Americans do not have access to broadband. But this is just not credible. It's based on the same problematic methodology you called for us to stop using in the Broadband Data Act. Yet despite not having fixed our broadband data, the FCC is poised to hand out billions in federal support next month based on maps we know are wrong. We can't afford to delay improved data any further. because we will never be sure that we are targeting our universal service support to the right places. Second, we need a plan to keep all Americans connected. At the start of the pandemic, the chairman secured a commitment from our nation's carriers to not cut off consumers during this crisis, and this was good. But that commitment ended this summer, so what comes next? I think the FCC needs to update the Lifeline program to meet this moment. We also have to update disaster response because we need to stay connected when awful weather events, like the ongoing wildfires and hurricanes, do unthinkable damage to our communities. Third, we need a plan to secure our 5G future. If we want to be a global leader in the next generation of wireless, we need a whole of government approach to 5G service. But our national spectrum strategy is more than a year overdue, and federal authorities are fighting in public about access to 5G spectrum bands. At the same time, we need to remove the insecure Chinese equipment in our networks today and take steps to support open radio access networks in the future. Fourth and finally, we need a plan to sustain local media and stand up for the First Amendment. Local news is vital, but despite the increased demand for news right now, the economics that underlie the industry are changing. To meet these new challenges, I believe we need to study our rules and identify how to better support local media and diversity. But one thing we shouldn't do is compromise our values, including those in the First Amendment. Nowhere is this clearer than with the recent executive order concerning Section 230 of the Communications Act. I know that social media can be frustrating, but an executive order that seeks to turn the FCC into the president's speech police is not the answer. Thank you. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Commissioner Starks for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you here today. Our longstanding digital divide has evolved into a monstrous COVID-19 divide. When this pandemic first hit, I highlighted the critical role that broadband would play in our response and called for a number of ways in which the Commission must advance a connectivity stimulus to increase access to broadband service. Over the last 6 months, some of those proposals have been adopted, but much more remains to be done. The need for affordable broadband is particularly great among American communities of color. Black, Indigenous, and Latinx Americans remain significantly less likely to have a home broadband connection than their counterparts by a wide margin. These families disproportionately rely on public Wi-Fi, frequently offered by public libraries and fast food restaurants. The FCC has a role to play. We should start by addressing the Lifeline program, which was designed to connect the most vulnerable Americans. We must better promote this critical program during the pandemic, a proposition that 144 members of Congress agreed with, including many from this committee. We also need to take a fresh look at the E-rate program. Like millions of families, I have a young learner who is in her room right now, virtually at school. Millions of families need connectivity that allows members to concurrently telework and teleeducate. But more than 15 million students still lack broadband at home and the devices to use it. We have got to do more for our students. The recent work of this FCC has been on the issue of rural access, an important one for me as a Kansan, but the numbers undeniably show that more than 3 times the number of households in urban communities remain unconnected as those in rural areas. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, research showed that broadband prices were too high for more than 18 million households that otherwise have service in their neighborhoods. We must address the issue of affordability. These issues demand the Commission's unwavering focus. Unfortunately, there are those who, during a political year, would use their weapons against their perceived adversaries during this year. The President's executive order on Section 230 and NTIA's subsequent petition for rulemaking claim to champion free speech, but they are really about working the refs at a pivotal moment for the President's political future. The FCC should reject NTIA's proposals and focus on our main mission right now, closing the digital divide. I've made my own investments to respond to these issues. Working with an advisory board of experts, this week I announced my first honorees of the Digital Opportunity for Equity Recognition, doers from rural areas to urban corridors, students to seniors. The collective scope of their accomplishments are impressive. Nationwide efforts that cover all 50 states, hundreds of community hotspots, connections for over 600,000 students to devices and broadband, connections to 16,000 public housing units, thousands of miles of rural connectivity, support for school districts, over 160 libraries, and support for over 400 tribal communities. I'm honored to recognize the 22 people, organizations, and companies that are working to connect all Americans to reliable, equitable, and affordable broadband services. The fight for equity isn't limited to telecommunications services. In the wake of the larger movement for justice, the Commission must do its part to advance policies that center on our most marginalized and create opportunities internally to ensure that we have a far more diverse voice at the table. That's why I was proud to announce with the chairman this week the FCC's Early Career Staff Diversity Initiative. Under this program, the Commission will offer paid internships for students who may otherwise be unable to afford to live in DC for a semester, and specifically increase our recruitment for internships and honors attorneys and engineers from historically Black colleges and universities and other minority serving institutions. We can and should take steps to proactively usher in a diverse generation of policy advocates into the communications sector. Thank you for inviting me here today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. We've concluded our opening statements. We're now going to move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses, and I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Chairman, I would just note that all of those admonitions that you talked about in your opening statement, with the exception of C-band, because COVID prevented us from dealing with that, this committee and this House has done. You need to save that speech for the Senate Republicans next time you're over in the Senate. Mr. Chairman, I want to ask, I would like you to answer my questions with just a simple yes or no. There's not going to be any trick questions, okay? So please do me that courtesy so I won't have to appear rude by interrupting you and asking you to please just say yes or no. I have a lot of questions I'd like to get through, so I'd appreciate your cooperation with that. Let me start by asking you, Mr. Chairman, as we face one of the worst crises in our nation's history, do you feel that so far you've done everything in the Commission's power to help Americans who are struggling to deal with the impacts of this pandemic? Yes or no? Thank you. Chairman Pai, have you done everything in the Commission's power to help the tens of millions of Americans who cannot afford high-speed internet access that is so essential to all of our lives right now?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, have you done everything in the Commission's power to help the millions of students across our country who are struggling to get into virtual classrooms because they lack internet access?
Within our power, yes.
Thank you. Have you have said that you asked Congress for additional funds to help connect students in March as part of the CARES Act. Could you give me the dollar figure you requested? You don't have to say yes or no to this one. I'm looking for the dollar figure you requested.
I can't remember the dollar figure, but I do remember we asked for authorization and for funding.
Yeah, the number you requested was 50 million to connect more than 12 million plus students that lack internet access, not to mention the millions more that don't have sufficient bandwidth for distance learning. Did you ask Congress for additional funds for low-income broadband assistance as part of the CARES Act?
We asked for additional funding to cover some of the costs in June when the Keep Americans Connected Act pledge expired. So we did.
But I don't believe you asked for any additional funds. Now, I understand that during the Senate Commerce Oversight hearing that you told Senators Blumenthal and Schatz that you are limited by law about how E-rate funds are restricted to the classroom use only. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And Commissioner Rosenworcel, let me ask you, Section 254 of the Communications Act does give the Commission authority to designate additional special services to support schools, libraries, and healthcare providers, not just classrooms, periodically and adapted to changes in technology, which are essential to education, and to periodically and adapt to changes in technology, which are essential to education. Isn't that correct?
You're absolutely right. That's the correct reading of Section 254.
And Commissioner Rosenworcel, in 2010, As part of the FCC's sixth report and order on E-rate, the Commission established a $10 million pilot program to distribute wireless hotspots for use by off-campus students and library patrons. I believe the vote to approve that order was bipartisan, with then Commissioner Meredith Baker on approving and concurring. Isn't that correct?
That's right. We've done it before. We can do it again.
And finally, was that program deemed illegal or an unauthorized use of FCC's authority?
No, not at all. It is totally authorized and totally possible today.
So my understanding of what we have talked about is that the FCC has used its authority in the past to establish a wireless hotspot program for off-campus students, and that program was not overturned by the courts. And then, when given the opportunity to ask for additional resources from Congress, you requested $4 per student without internet access and no additional funds to help connect low-income Americans through Lifeline. You have before you the means and the opportunity to help millions of people at one of our nation's greatest moments of need. And I really encourage you, Mr. Chairman, to step up to the moment that history has presented you. Commissioner Rosenworth, with the remainder of my time, what did you make of all of this?
We have a crisis. We have, by most recent count, 17 million students who are locked out of the virtual classroom. The homework gap that they suffer from is becoming an education gap, and it's going to be a long-term opportunity gap. The FCC has tools right now with the E-rate program to help solve this crisis. We need to meet this moment and do it.
Thank you, Commissioner. I see my time is expiring, so I will yield back and now recognize Mr. Latta, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. And again, thanks to the commissioners for being with us today. Commissioner Carr, if I could start my questions with you. First, again, I want to thank you very much for coming out to the 5th District in Northwest Ohio in the last couple of weeks to see what's happening out there. And as we both mentioned about having visited the Behavioral Health Organization and seeing these absolutely incredible increase from 467 uses of telehealth to over 16,000 in a short period of time during the pandemic. I applaud the FCC for how quickly you were able to provide funds in such a short amount of time. Commissioner, in what ways is the Commission learning from the COVID-19 telehealth program to ensure the success of the Connected Care pilot program?
Well, Congressman, thank you for the question. Thank you for the leadership. As you mentioned, we saw how the FCC's immediate actions helped to support the mental and behavioral health services. And earlier that same day, we met with a small internet provider that used an immediate infusion of FCC spectrum to expand capacity at homes, including with homes that have school kids that are learning right now. There's a lot of lessons learned from this program we can build on, including some issues with licensing and reimbursement. HHS has done a great job clearing some of that red tape. There's been a recent memorandum of understanding between the FCC and HHS that I think will be beneficial as we move into the Connected Care pilot. And frankly, there's 26 bills that are in this committee right now that were introduced by you, Congressman Walden, and other members that would help close the digital divide immediately, accelerate those bills. And I think if those wouldn't languish here, I think that'd be some more progress we could make.
Well, streamlining and finding the ways we can get things out there faster is so important, especially what we've seen during the COVID-19. So thank you very much. Commissioner Riley, first, I want to thank you again for your willingness to come to my district twice to really get a firsthand knowledge of what's going on out on the ground. So I really appreciate your service on the commission, and you should be very proud of all that you've accomplished during this time. Commissioner, you've played a significant role in championing unlicensed spectrum, and you recognized long ago the growing demand for Wi-Fi. Now with COVID-19, the demand is greater than what I think any of us could imagine when you factor in telehealth, telework, distance learning, precision agriculture. And as co-chair of the Wi-Fi caucus, I'm interested in making sure we are maximizing the benefits of unlicensed services. Would you speak to what the FCC is working on to expand Wi-Fi capabilities and the new types of technology it will enable?
Well, first of all, thank you for your leadership on Wi-Fi issues. They're so important. The Commission has done great work on 6 gigahertz. We hopefully will have new work on 5.9 gigahertz, but on 6 gigahertz, there's a couple portions that need to still be addressed. We need to increase the power limits for the low power indoors aspect. And we also need to finish the very low power portion. It's been out there for a while and hopefully be done this year. That's how you get to the advanced services for the very small distances, AR, VR, a bunch of different things that you've taken a lead on. Internet of Things, so critical, and we need to address that before the end of this year.
Well, thank you very much. Chairman Pai, again, I want to thank you for the times you've been out to the district. You've been very, very helpful, especially earlier this year when you actually got to see telehealth at work as we were there. But you plan to begin later this year the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund reverse auction, which will provide $20 billion for broadband deployment. What other ways can we inject investment into our rural broadband and make sure we have that access out there?
I think there are a number of different ways. For example, at the FCC, we've offered ACAM to certain carriers to enable them to increase the speeds they're offering up to 25 megabits per second and expand their networks. We've also made some deregulatory reforms like One Touch Make Ready to enable competitive providers to advance. One of the things I proposed 4 years ago this week was in Ohio, actually, was a rural dividend to reserve 10% of auction proceeds for rural broadband deployment. And I think that's something that Congress would do very well to consider, because that would help us increase the resources available to close that digital divide once and for all.
Well, thank you. You know, as we look at the RDOF, do you have any estimate as how many Americans will gain broadband under this?
Yes, the estimate is 10.4 million unserved Americans who may be eligible for broadband under the program.
Well, and again, it's so important because, again, as you and Commissioners Carr and O'Reilly have been to the district to see firsthand what's out in our area, it's so important that we get that rural broadband, not just in the 5th Congressional District, but across the country. And we appreciate your willingness and your work on it. And Mr. Chairman, my time's expired and I yield back.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman yields back, and now the chair recognizes Mr. Pallone, the full committee chair, for his 5 minutes of questions. Is the chairman there? Okay, the chair will recognize Mr. McNerney for his 5 minutes of questions.
Well, I thank the chairman. You know, every school in my district is starting at 100% disability learning. In addition to the stress of wildfires and the many challenges of shifting to distance learning, the burden of addressing connectivity gaps facing students has fallen entirely on our schools. Commissioner Rosenworcel, you recently heard firsthand from education leaders in my district about how hard they're working to connect students. Despite the short-term solutions they've scrambled to adopt, they're all voiced concerned about the need for long-term solutions. One county superintendent said, "We need to be looking at long-term solutions for when we are through COVID. Our students still need to be connected, our families still need to be connected, and they need to not worry about whether they're going to pay for their internet service or put food on the table." Commissioner Rosenworcel, what steps should the FCC have taken prior to the pandemic to lessen the burden that has fallen on schools, and what long-term solutions should the FCC be looking at now?
We have to recognize that the homework gap is one of the cruelest parts of our nation's digital divide. Every child deserves to have the internet connection they need for school. They now need it because they're remote learning. But when we get past these days and when this pandemic is over, they're still going to need it for nightly schoolwork. We need to update the E-rate program to address the homework gap, because we have a crisis on our hands with millions and millions of students who don't have full access to the education that they need.
Thank you, Commissioner. Over the last month, my district has been coated in smoke and ash, and nearly every part of our state has been ravaged by wildfires. Worrying about deadly fire spreading quickly is the new norm in my district. I would expect that the agency overseeing our nation's communications network to do everything possible to keep my constituents connected during wildfires, because when it's a matter of life and death, an announcement about voluntary industry forum is not enough. I'm extremely disappointed that there hasn't been any real action from the agency. In fact, during our last oversight hearing, Chairman Pai committed to me that he would hold a wildfire hearing in Northern California. 4 months passed before I heard from him, at which point he said he hoped that he could do it but wouldn't be able to. My constituents deserve more than broken promises. Commissioner Rosenworcel, what more should the FCC be doing to ensure that people can stay connected during wildfires?
You know, these once-in-a-lifetime weather events are now happening with extraordinary frequency. And it's not just the wildfires, it's the hurricanes, it's the derecho storms. We have got to update our playbook for communications disaster. We need to standardize our reporting. We need to require reporting about broadband outages. We only require reporting about voice telephony outages. We've got to update the wireless resiliency framework, and then we need to have a national conversation about backup power, because so many of us rely on IP and wireless services that require electricity to keep us connected.
Thank you again. Commissioner Starks, under the Keep America Connected pledge, that the companies also commit to notifying consumers about the promises they were making in the pledge, or could the companies agree to the pledge to get a positive DC press hit and then hide it from their consumers, from their customers?
Yes, thank you for the question, Congressman. I don't believe it was part of the pledge that they notify their consumers about the Keep America Connected pledge. One additional thing that I've started to have concerns about is obviously the Keep America Connected pledge obligated those companies not to disconnect consumers while they were during the pledge, but those debts and those bills are still accruing. And so I do have some concern about everyday Americans that are making decisions between groceries and paying bills, and making sure that these providers are keeping folks connected even still.
Chairman Pai, I'm worried about many people had no idea about the promises made in the pledge, and that those who did encountered problems when they tried to take advantage of the offerings. During the telebriefings with our committee in mid-May, you told me that the FCC received 2,200 COVID-related complaints from consumers, including 500 about the pledge. The pledge was in effect for more than a month after that, so I'm sure that the complaint numbers have grown. It should not take a congressional inquiry and a FOIA request for the American public to uncover these problems, especially during a pandemic when nearly every aspect of our lives depends on connectivity. Chairman Pai, please answer with a yes or no. Will you commit to publicly post all consumer complaints about internet and phone service during the pandemic, properly de-identified to protect the individual privacy? Will you make that commitment, yes or no?
Carson's not a yes or no question. I'll certainly consider it in the aggregate if there's no PII, of course, involved. And if, from a feasibility standpoint, we have the ability to compile all that information, I'd be happy to do so. But I would note that I appreciate the committee at least touting on its own page of accomplishments the fact that we initiated the pledge and started all these pro-consumer initiatives like the pledge.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Walden for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thanks to all the commissioners for your testimony today and your work every day. I wanted to, just for the committee's purposes and the commissioners, we did the work when I was chairman of the subcommittee to implement FirstNet and get that up and running. We did regular oversight over it. And over the weekend, I received this. I don't know if you can see this, but this is a photo of a FirstNet SAP Colt in Gates, Oregon, providing communications for first responders in the fires that so tragically affected Congressman Schrader's district in Oregon. But I think, every once in a while we need to pause and say our work actually is playing out on the ground. And while we all know there's a lot more to do to close the digital divide, to add to diversity and broadcast ownership and all of these things, it is important to note that a lot of good people are working really hard every day to implement what Congress has enacted. As you know, Republicans had 26 bills in this communications agenda that we'd like to see move forward in the committee. We've got a lot of ideas. I know the administration has moved forward to make more spectrum available, and while the FCC is an independent agency, the Trump administration recently announced they're making 100 megahertz of critical spectrum in the 3450 to 3550 megahertz band available to the FCC to auction for commercial 5G deployment by the American wireless industry. I and most all my colleagues sitting around me believe the private sector should build out our 5G network. And I just have a simple yes or no question for each of the commissioners following my chairman's leadership here, Mr. Doyle. Yes or no, do you oppose a nationalized 5G network? Chairman Pai?
Yes.
Commissioner Carr? Commissioner O'Reilly?
Yes.
Yes.
Commissioner Roseworcel?
Yes, I assume you mean the administration's earlier proposal. Yes.
Any kind of nationalized 5G network. Mr. Starks? Thank you. I think my early statement when that first was being bandied about is that's what socialist countries do, and we're not Venezuela. So I think we've had a very vibrant auction system, a very vibrant innovation system in America, and all done on the private sector side. Chairman Doyle, last year you stated, I'm glad the FCC Chairman Pai agrees that a private sale of C-band was a terrible idea, close quote. But then Chairman Pai announced his plan for a public auction of the C-band. You stated, and I quote, "We believe that this proposal only reiterates the need for legislation, and we need legislation to provide the certainty needed for a rapid rollout of 5G and ensure all Americans benefit from the auction's public airwaves." Unfortunately, Congress was never able to come together on legislation like that, though we could have funded critical priorities had we done so in a timely manner, such as Next Gen 911. Chairman Pai, is the C-band auction still on track to begin at the end of the year, despite all the other work you've done to address COVID-19 pandemic issues?
It is very much so. The eligible satellite operators have opted into accelerated relocation payments. Knock on wood, we've won legal challenges thus far, and our staff is fully engaged on track to the December 8th start of the auction.
I appreciate that. And let's go back to this homework gap, Chairman Pai. What have you done? What's the FCC done under your leadership to help get broadband access to families who need this for schools? And what
We've
more
done
can
everything
be
within
done?
our power. In addition to the Keep Americans Connected pledge, which was of course critical for getting home broadband maintained, we also relaxed E-rate gift rules, for example, to allow service providers to offer and schools to solicit and accept some of the connectivity tools. In addition to that, as the chairman pointed out, I asked for funding, $50 million additionally, in order to just get a foot in the door, so to speak. I supported a bigger program, but Congress chose to give $16 billion to the Department of Education through the CARES Act. So, look, we partnered with the Department of Education to make sure that schools and governors knew that funding was eligible. Now you're seeing governors from Oklahoma to Alabama to Delaware use that funding for education technology. Moving forward, we look forward to working on a remote learning initiative if it ever comes to pass, but we've done a lot within the contours of the statute. I know there's a vogue now that we should just ignore the law and come up with money out of thin air, but in the real world, in an administration where we have to focus on the tools that we have, we've done a lot to promote remote learning.
So the earlier discussion about the $50 million in your request or no request, what you're saying is Congress already sent $16 billion to the Department of Education for these issues, and you've partnered with them to help get kids connected.
Absolutely. We immediately got in touch with the Department of Education. We've done a lot of outreach with governors and local school districts and the like. And now we are seeing forward-thinking governors and local officials use that money, that $16 billion, for education technology.
All right. Thank you again to all of you going forward. I hope our paths continue to cross, but thanks in the meantime for your service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would just note that we didn't move on C-band because of Senate Republicans and because many of us didn't want to give $10 billion away to foreign satellite companies. I would also note the Senate refused to spend any C-band money on Next Gen 911, despite what you just said, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Ranking Member. Chair now recognizes Mr. Loebsack for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank the committee for having this markup today. And I thank the commissioners for being here. As a member of this committee, it's been an honor and a privilege to bring the voice of Iowans into this room and before the commission at these oversight hearings. This may be my last subcommittee meeting too, along with Mr. Walden. I hope it's not. but I've really enjoyed my time on the committee and on the subcommittee. But I'm going to end up leaving, I think, with a whole lot of frustration, especially when it comes to things like improving rural broadband, and something that I worked on for quite a long time. As many of you know, getting better maps to build out broadband infrastructure. It's been a bipartisan priority, as everybody knows. I've had some great partners on this committee, not only the leadership of Chairman Pallone and Doyle, but also most recently my partners in introducing and passing the Broadband Data Act, Representatives McKeechin and Latta and Billy Long. So it has been truly frustration, or it's been truly wonderful with that bipartisanship. But I do have frustrations that I want to bring before the committee and the commission today. The Broadband Data Act was not the first bill that I worked with my colleagues on, passed through this committee, to make sure that the FCC fixes the maps. And it has been evident and clear to this committee, to stakeholders, and indeed the FCC for years that the maps have been bad. All of you recognize that, all of you admit that. And yet we still haven't fixed the maps. It's kind of like when they say just wear the damn mask, let's just fix the damn maps, right? It really should be that easy. But we still don't have good data for building out broadband, and too many people lack good access to good internet. And the COVID crisis, of course, has just really, I think, brought that to the fore more than was the case prior to that. And it's become even clearer as our nation has continued to limp along through this pandemic. As we look towards the future, where more people might be increasingly doing remote work, and my daughter out in Seattle is now working completely from home, the company told everybody to do that, and look to relocate away from big cities to rural areas, which I think is going to happen more. People need to know that when they relocate, that they will have good access to good and affordable broadband, regardless of where they move to. So why has it taken so long? Why has the FCC been unable to tackle this challenge? Why can't someone obtain useful information about where broadband is and what the cost and quality of service of that broadband is? So with the remaining time I have, I want to ask Commissioner Rosenworcel. First of all, I want to say I do appreciate that you touched on these topics in your testimony. So my first question goes to you. What has gone wrong, and how does the FCC do better in the future? That's a big question, but what's your answer?
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate how many years you worked on getting better data about our nation's broadband. I know it's important for Iowa, it's important for everyone. And in a town where there's so little consensus on anything, there's consensus that we need better data. And here's the truth, it's hard. It's not easy. We're going to have to figure out with a level of granular accuracy where service is and is not, because we have to reach 100% of this country. But we did it before with rural electrification. This is the challenge that we have right now because we have to do it again. And the truth is, we just haven't made enough progress at the FCC. We put it off for another day. We keep on claiming that we need additional funds, we need additional time. It's just not good enough. We're never going to manage the problems we don't measure. We have to make getting better data job one.
So in your view, it's really the FCC's just got to make that commitment and carry out that commitment. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, and how do we ensure that the internet is more affordable and that consumers know that they're getting a fair deal when they sign up for broadband? What can the FCC do to that, so when we can get this done? Again, that's the huge question in everybody's mind, I guess. But it's not just a rural issue; it's an urban issue when it comes to affordability as well. If you could speak to that, please.
Yeah, that's such a good point. When we talk about the digital divide, in recent years, we've talked almost exclusively about rural America, infrastructure, and deployment. But the truth is that there are 3 to 4 times as many households in urban and suburban America that don't have connections.
That's
and
right.
We're never going to solve our nation's digital divide without developing equal resource and policy attention for adoption and deployment. And part of that adoption equation is affordability. But the FCC has refused to discuss that in its annual broadband reports, and it's time we change that.
Thank you so much. My time has ended. I appreciate it. Thanks to the commissioners. Thanks to the chair and ranking member, and I yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Now gives the chair great pleasure to yield to a fellow suffering Pittsburgh Pirate fan, My friend Gus Bilirakis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I never give up. I never give up. The Steelers look good too this past weekend. Anyway, under your leadership, Chairman Pai, a question is for Chairman Pai. Under your leadership, the commission has made a significant amount of spectrum available for commercial use. While the Democrat National Broadband Plan in 2010 called for the commission to make 500 megahertz of spectrum available in the next 10 years, your commission alone has made over 300 megahertz available for licensed use and over 20 gigahertz available for unlicensed use. The commission is also on its way to making 530 megahertz of mid-band spectrum available for 5G and 1200 megahertz for more unlicensed spectrum than any other commission ever. We appreciate your efforts, the entire commission. Pursuant to that, I just wanted to follow up on the July 30th letter regarding the 3.3 to 3.55 gigahertz band. WFLA TV Channel 8 in my area currently operates a state-of-the-art digital Doppler system in that band, which can detect and track Gulf Coast storms with much greater accuracy than similar systems in the C-band. So this is very important to my constituents. With the heightened activity of hurricanes in the Gulf Coast already this year, including the current Hurricane Sally, these S-band systems are clearly important for saving lives, protecting property, and curbing costs to rebuild. Can you commit to keeping these public safety Doppler systems in mind as you advance changes in the S-band? So if you could reply, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. We certainly can and will keep that in mind, given their important function. And we have determined that there may be alternative spectrum available for them in the 2.9 to 3.0 gigahertz band. So we will make sure that we accommodate that concern to the extent we can.
Appreciate it so very much. I'll yield the rest. Oh, he's not, okay. I know that, okay, Representative Scalise not ready. Let me go ahead and, Chairman Pai, one area that is of increased concern for me and the nation is contraband cell phones in prisons, not to be confused with the prison payphone debate regarding inmate calls to loved ones. Recently, my staff was able to find cases in 47 states, unbelievable, where illegally used cell phones were used by prisoners to facilitate crimes on the outside. This includes a case in Oklahoma where prisoners were using cell phones to sell meth, heroin, and illegal firearms. And a case in Tallahassee, in my state, where an inmate coordinated with a convicted, non-detained pedophile to endanger his own daughter. Hard to believe. I understand that the FCC is reviewing ways to fight this, and I have been seeking a bipartisan solution to this problem. Actually, I worked on this in the legislature as well. Do you believe that an increase in civil penalties on inmates and their facilitators would help reduce the incidence of behind bars contraband communications related to crimes? For Chairman Pop.
I appreciate the question, Congressman. It's a serious issue, as I've seen firsthand in a variety of correctional facilities that I've visited. Civil penalty increases could be useful. That would not be within the FCC's jurisdiction under current law. So what we've done is to ask some of the different stakeholders in this area to identify different solutions specifically with data on interdiction programs that have worked and those that have not. And we've sought comment on 6 different issues. Hope to get back some meaningful information on that so we can move forward to address this serious public safety problem that I think many people might not be aware of.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I will always be the eternal optimist when it comes to the Pittsburgh Pirates.
Yeah, that takes a lot of optimism on our parts, Gus. Okay, The chair was going to recognize Mr. Vesey from Texas. Is he on? Okay, I don't think so. The chair will recognize Mr. McEachin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
There we go.
I trust you can hear me just fine.
We can hear you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you for your fine leadership in calling this meeting here today. With the emergence of the COVID-19 global pandemic, we've seen through the eyes of our nation's students, families, and small businesses the serious repercussions of being on the wrong side of the digital divide in an increasingly digital world. While there are many variables that factor into the digital divide, like my colleague, Mr. Lopsak, I want to focus on our inaccurate broadband maps. First of all, I cannot echo enough my friend's frustration over the length of time it's taken for the FCC to do something regarding maps. For years, there has been bipartisan, bicameral, interagency agreement on the fact that maps are inaccurate. And yet it took until July of 2020, only after the congressional action, for the FCC to approve the Digital Opportunity Data Collection Order. I think we can all agree that while long overdue, this step is necessary. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. However, the FCC has chosen to move forward with the first round of Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, preparing to award over $16 billion of taxpayer money 5 days before the November election, using the same flawed and inaccurate maps. To be clear, I'm ecstatic that there is money going forward to rural broadband and closing the digital divide, and I'm not advocating for a delay. I'm sure providers have already begun developing business plans with the assumption that these auctions will happen. I am curious, however, as to the calculus of committing this money without first waiting for the more accurate maps, as well as potential repercussions of such a move. Commissioner Rosenworcel, do you believe this money should have been awarded before or after the FCC broadband maps were fixed? Broadband maps were fixed. And what happens to the underserved communities in round 2 that were not identified because of the bad maps used in phase 1?
We're never going to be able to solve our nation's digital divide without information. And all of us know right now that our information is flawed. In fact, an industry group came together and said that our data 2 in 5, an error rate of 2 in 5. And yet we're going to use that data to give out $16 billion a week before the election. And that $16 billion represents 80% of our funds for the next 10 years. If you ask me, we are careening toward a disaster with waste, fraud, and abuse here. We're giving out billions and billions of dollars a week before the election when we know our data is wrong, and it could be wrong as much as 2 in 5. I think that's a problem.
Well, with respect, Congressman, the maps that we're using before
The question was not directed
this
to you, Mr.
fall
Carr.
are not.
I'm reclaiming my time, Mr. Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel, just to confirm, is it possible that a certain locality could lose out on RDOF funding if a provider is over-reporting they service that area?
The answer is yes.
In about 2 years, the Office of Economics and Analytics created by Chairman Pai went from 0 employees to close to 100. But now the FCC is claiming that it needs additional dedicated funding to fix its broadband maps. It seems like where there's a will, there's a way, and does not seem to be a lot of will when it comes to improving the maps. Commissioner Rosenworcel, Commissioner Starks, would you care to comment?
You know, just what you said, when there's a will, there's a way. When Congress gave the agency CARES Act funding, we cleared the decks. We had dozens of staff work to get out $200 million in record time for telehealth. We need to treat this mapping task with the same speed and efficiency. We're just not doing that right now.
I appreciate your answer, Mr. Chairman. I see my time is winding down. I go back.
Congressman, with respect, I think it's important that we correct the record because the maps that are at issue.
Commissioner
Carr, my
Congressman will
time is up.
suspend.
I've yielded back to Mr. Doyle, Mr. Carr.
I would ask all witnesses to please address questions that are addressed to you and not to make statements when you're not being asked a question. The chair now yields 5 minutes to Mr. Long for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start my questioning, I'd like to acknowledge Chairman Pai's commitment to connecting Americans for future generations through, just to name a few, a light touch regulatory approach of the internet, smart spectrum policy, and a commitment to make 5G a reality. That's why I call him 5G Pai. Number one, for my question, I'd like to go to Commissioner O'Reilly. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your service for over a decade of service on the commission. You have seen the failures of the Obama-Biden administration when it comes to distributing broadband funding to areas that received other government subsidies or even private deployment. In her testimony, Commissioner Rosenworcel, hope I did that all right, stated, quote, extending the policies from the past that got us where we are now is not good enough. We need to do more. And for once, I agree with the commissioner on these failed Obama-Biden policies. So Commissioner O'Reilly, what has the commission done to improve our maps and get broadband deployed down to underserved areas?
Well, look, the chairman's done great work in trying to improve the maps. We all agree that our maps are flawed and need to be improved. I think that I take issue with the point in terms of the RDOF going forward. Those are areas that we know for sure are not being served today. So moving forward is not a problem and don't require the maps to be advanced for that purpose. So I appreciate the point, but we are really trying to address the fact that the chairman gave data points of how 10.4 million Americans can be served if this program on phase 1 goes forward. And that's in great news for those that are unserved today and need to be addressed.
But don't you think these inaccurate maps that we have are a problem?
Oh, absolutely. And we have to fix that problem. I've recognized that years ago and it said as much. So that is something that has to be done. One thing that goes hand in hand with that is making sure that other agencies are working with our, as we adopt new maps and adopt new data points, that they use them as well. And we're not seeing that yet. I'm hopeful that works, that there is coordination amongst agencies.
And I want to address my next question to everyone, kind of have everyone on the panel answer this. As we ask you, the FCC, to make more spectrum available for 5G, my hope is we rely on the free market to build out our broadband networks, not nationalized government-sponsored networks. We can't out-China China by being more like China. Let's rely on the free markets to get it done. Does everyone on the panel agree that more spectrum is for 5G?
Yes, Congressman, I do.
Yes.
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 I think I got everyone. Does everyone on the panel agree that more mid-band spectrum is needed for 5G?
Congressman, yes, I do.
Absolutely, yes.
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 Yes as well.
Thank you. And does everyone on the panel agree that C-band is the best source of prime mid-band spectrum in the United States at this time?
Thanks to the FCC majority's work, yes.
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 I think so, but I don't think it's the only spectrum that we have for mid-band on tap.
I would agree. I think the need is for 5G to have more mid-band spectrum more holistically, of which the C-band is an important piece.
Thank you all. And does everyone on the panel agree that the commission should keep to the schedule and start the C-band auction on December 8th?
Yes, Congressman. Yes, Congressman, I do. And I'm glad we didn't wait for legislation before doing so.
Yes.
I don't know if I got all of the yeses, but
Well, Congressman, I did not support the underlying decision to move ahead without Congress, so I think that complicates my answer here. But I appreciate that the agency is trying to move ahead right now.
okay. Thank you all, and thank you for being here today by Zoom or wherever you are by Zoom or whatever we call this, WebEx. I think we're all getting a little more used to it. I just hope it's not a permanent thing. It's a lot nicer to see you all in person, be able to look in the eye and ask these questions. And I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Steve Scalise.
So moved. Has the gentleman yielded back?
I tried to yield to Scalise, but I don't see him on there. So
gentleman's time has expired.
That being said, okay, I yield back what time I don't have to yield.
Thank you. And I would ask all of our panelists and our members to check your buttons to make sure that you're muted so that we can minimize background noise. With that, the chair will recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a great hearing that we're having today. And obviously, we need to continue to talk more about this, as we really do have a problem in America that needs to be fixed. We've been in this pandemic now for 6 months, and it really is terrible to see the administration failing all Americans on the right and left. We know in this digital divide, having broadband internet at home is critical to everything that we do, especially now, from virtual learning to telehealth to applying for a job or paying rent. All of these connections are only as strong as our weakest signal. We need to make sure we have a reliable connection at home, and my 9th grader better be logged into his class right now instead of watching me do this or doing something else. Last week, some of you may have saw this. The CEO of AT&T wrote an op-ed about connecting every American to broadband. In it, he said, "Our networks still don't reach everyone, and private dollars alone will not solve this challenge." And I agree with him. The Lifeline program can help bridge this gap. I tried to address this in my Emergency Broadband Connections Act, which was later passed by the House as part of the HEROES Act, which would help struggling low-income Americans afford broadband service. Unfortunately, the Senate Majority Leader doesn't seem to care about it, and the bill is stalled. It's blatant partisanship that we're trying to fight through to make sure that we can serve people, but we're going to keep struggling and to keep fighting because people need to get online. The Lifeline program doesn't have many fixed broadband providers, and we know from recent studies that low-income and minority communities have the lowest adoption of fixed broadband at home. That's going to hold communities back. Rather than advancing thoughtful proposals about how this vital program could have been used to solve this issue, the FCC did nothing. They did nothing but undermine the Lifeline program with proposals that were either thrown out by the courts or so heavily criticized by industry and consumers that they were never even finalized. And my question to Commissioner Rosenworcel is, how could this FCC have better used its time to make sure the Lifeline program was helping consumers afford home broadband services?
That's a good question, because, you know, in this crisis, if you don't have a broadband connection, so many households don't have a fair shot at maintaining access to school, to work, to healthcare, to being able to call in an emergency and reach out and get assistance. These things are now essential. And the dial tone of the digital age is broadband. So our Lifeline program needs to be rethought from front to back to make sure that every household has a fair shot at getting connected. Again, we got to recenter this program for this crisis right now to make sure everyone can get online, because it's essential to maintain some semblance of modern life.
Yeah, no, thank you, Commissioner. And I know that for a lot of people, particularly when you talk about issues like race, it's just uncomfortable. They don't like to talk to them. They don't like to talk about these types of things. But the fact of the matter is, everything that's going on in this country right now, we know that that part of the issue is economics, and in order to be able to close those gaps that deal with economics, people have to have a good education. They have to have access to things like broadband. And so we have got to continue to have these discussions. Commissioner Starks, looking back at these 4 years, what more could have been done to increase broadband adoption? And should the FCC be collecting data about broadband adoption?
Yes, thank you for the question, Congressman. You know, and I have said that this administration has focused on the rural access issue, but nearly 3 times as many households are in urban areas that are disconnected. Census research shows that more than 18 million of those households specifically cannot afford broadband at home. It is too expensive. And especially when you're talking about 50+ million Americans that are unemployed right now, folks are making very clear decisions on whether to pay for groceries or pay for broadband. And so we need to focus on the issue of adoption, which I think is very much tied to the issue of affordability. And so I do think that we have missed this opportunity. We should be collecting this data. The legislation that you have proposed, I think, is essential to this as well.
What is there anything specific that you think needs to be done that would make it more likely that people could have broadband at their home? Or are there some things that we're missing that we're not talking about?
Yes, you know, I think the first thing is we are going to need to study quite clearly and as quickly as possible what it actually is going to mean. What is the price point that we are going to need low-income Americans to be able to afford that home connection? For many folks, we know obviously Internet Essentials for Comcast is a $9 program. I think ultimately what we're going to need to get to is something that is $9, $10, $11, $12, $13, something in the low teens that is going to provide real high quality access to Americans. And then we're going to need to make sure that at the end of the day, I think providers are going to be interested in this. I know there's legislation because you're talking about picking up 18, 19, 20 million customers. And so I know providers are going to be interested in that. I know a lot of these are issues that we talk about at our CBC function as well. Congressman, thank you for the invitation.
The gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Flores for 5 minutes. You need to unmute, Bill. There you go.
There we go. My unmute button wasn't working. Sorry about that. And I need to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
All right, thank the gentleman from yielding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the FCC commissioners for coming here. It's really important that we continue to talk about what we need to do to make sure access is available for everybody, that we continue to have good, smart policy, so that what we see throughout the country, the 5G build-out that's going on, the billions and billions of dollars of private investment that is being spent to help get us even better ability for technology, as well as the billions of dollars that we put in place through the CARES Act and other means to help bridge the rural divide. But I think if we start, it's important to go back and look at some of the things that have been said in the past, because we're literally having a hearing right now using the internet. And I remember back when Chairman Pai and other leaders were right to say that this net neutrality policy that would have really devastated the internet, a government takeover of the internet, would have stifled the billions of investment that give us this opportunity. It was the right decision, but let's remember back at what was said when Chairman Pai and others said we need to stop the government takeover the internet. You literally had members of Congress, you had FCC commissioners saying this would be the end of the internet. Go back to 2017. Go back years ago. There were people, I know, here's a quote from Senator Bernie Sanders. He literally said, under this terribly misguided proposal, the internet as we have come to know it would cease to exist. So I don't know if we're using strings and cans to have this hearing, but years ago they said, Chairman Pai, your leadership, what you did would, the internet would cease to exist, and yet here we are. Do you want to address that? Because again, those things were said, yet we made smart policy. We're doing even more. There's more we need to do, but we're here today because of this great innovation in America. And obviously, you know what was said about it before, but it's working, and we're seeing more build out of broadband. We're going to continue to make that happen. We're confronting China on things like Huawei and abuse of data that was happening under the previous administration. We're finally confronting those challenges. If you want to address that, and then I'll yield back to Mr. Flores.
Thanks, Congressman. I mean, this is one of the most hyperbolic instances of public policy debate I've ever seen. End of the internet as we know it. You're going to have to pay $5 per tweet. You'll get the internet one word at a time. Even more hyperbolic commentary, including from members of Congress, calling this decision un-American. And the proof is in the pudding now. Speeds have more than doubled since we made our decision. Millions more Americans have access to the internet. The internet is better than ever, with venture capital setting a record for startups in the last year. And I think by contrast, Europe, which is suffering from lower infrastructure investment, has now had to proactively go to providers like YouTube and Netflix and ask them to throttle content consumers during the pandemic because they have these heavy-handed net neutrality regulations that disincentivize investment. It's one of the great exploding cigars in the history of public policy. I'm glad that there are members like you willing to call those who made these ridiculous claims to account.
Thank you for that, Mr. Pai, and for your leadership, as well as the rest of the FCC. And I yield back to Mr. Flores and thank him for the time.
I thank Mr. Scalise for yielding back the time. I was hoping to have a little bit more left. I want to apologize to Chairman Pai and the other commissioners for the political overtones of this hearing. Look, the commission under the Obama administration wasted its time on net neutrality when it could have been trying to advance the rollout of broadband. And I think that the opening comments that Chairman Pai made were illustrative of the progress that's been made under the Trump administration toward greater broadband investment, greater broadband access, and greater technology access for hardworking American families. So I'm disappointed in the title of the hearing because it's just false. That said, I do have a few questions. I'm going to have to do most of these for the record. This is for Commissioners Carr and O'Reilly. I'd like to ask you, during the last two Congresses, I've introduced the License Transfer Modernization Act, and it's a bill that adds more regulatory certainty to business transactions involving FCC license transfers. This bill seeks to add common sense reform to the FCC's review of license transfers by creating a shot clock to encourage timely review, along with modified judicial review processes to hold the FCC accountable. I understand from interested parties that FCC transactions have been used to advance policies that are not directly related to the transaction before the Commission and that do not have enough support to become law. Those impacted by this process believe they have little recourse except to agree to the FCC's demands and conditions, regardless of whether those demands and conditions are relevant to the transaction or not. My legislation would mitigate this situation by placing an accountable time frame on how long the Commission may take to reach a decision. Commissioners Carr and O'Reilly, I'd be interested to know whether you share my concerns about how transactions have been used by the FCC in the past to push policies and agenda that are unrelated to the transaction before the Commission.
Well, I'll start. I absolutely agree with your point and have endorsed your legislation and hope that it will move forward at some point by the Congress.
I agree. I think that the ideas you put forward there, shot clocks, making sure that conditions are relevant to transaction, can create the certainty to enable more pro-consumer transactions.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. I would hope that someone would yield some time to Commissioner Carr to answer the question where he was interrupted before. Thank you.
Okay, I let the gentleman go on for an additional minute to even the score for the time that one of our members taken, but now we're even, and I'm going to enforce the shot clock a lot more. And I would just say to my good friend Steve Scalise, the only person I know that's proposing nationalizing 5G is Donald Trump. So you may want to have a conversation with him. And as recently as today, I understand his chief of staff has proposed nationalizing 5G. So you may want to have a chat with those two socialists over there and tell them that that's not something that you all agree with. And Donald Trump also is the person that's trying to propose to make the FCC the speech police. But with that, we'll now yield to Mr. Soto for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Soto, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the midst of a pandemic, internet access
is in all senses a lifeline. I'd be the first to admit that this FCC has worked with industry to extend our long-term progress that's been happening under many administrations on overall coverage. The problem is we're in the midst of the worst pandemic in 100 years. Normal incremental progress just won't cut it. We need extraordinary and heroic efforts. In other areas, I really wish you did do nothing. That would have been better than rolling back net neutrality rules that protect consumers and shrinking Lifeline programs that our seniors, Americans with disabilities, and families need to rely on. The committee's passed over 6 major bipartisan bills out of the House. These include legislation to restore the very net neutrality that this FCC eliminated. They also include mapping bills, which is really misleading in the initial testimony about that. And we also passed the CARES Act and the HEROES Act to meet this moment of crisis. This includes funding to address homework gap, low income and unemployment, get access to broadband, repealing T-band, and investing in infrastructure and affordable programs. And we passed the Moving Forward Act, which created a large infrastructure bill to significant telecom provisions. Mr. Chair, order, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. All right, thanks. Bye.
Does someone have, will everyone check to make sure that they have their mute button on? I hear background noise that is interrupting Mr. Soto. You can proceed, Mr. Soto.
Thank you. Let's get it together, members. If you want to find a committee that's done nothing, Chair Doyle has already told you, walk down the hall to the Republican Senate. During the pandemic, my wife has taught local students through distance learning and now is an academic coach in Osceola Public Schools. I could tell you firsthand from seeing her teach from our home that our teachers don't have proper technology and students don't have the devices and sufficient access to high-speed internet to be able to learn properly, and they're falling through the cracks. This will have a devastating, long-lasting effect on educational progress of students from fiscally challenged communities and communities of color. Compounding those matters, the Washington Post just published an article about a young student named Paige McConnell, a young Anglo woman living in rural Tennessee, that because of her lack of access to internet, she's dropping out of community college, even though she was the first one from her family to do so. And quote, some 100,000 fewer high school seniors completed financial aid applications to attend college this year. 100,000. The commission can cherry pick statistics and pat yourselves in the back all you want. This is the reality we face right now, and we have to step up big time. Commissioner Rosenworcel, thank you for your leadership and passionate plea about expanding internet access for students and teachers to meet this challenge of distance learning. I just want to clarify, what can be done by the FCC under existing authority to help with distance learning that hasn't already been done?
You know, thank you for your discussion of what's happening to students, because we have a national crisis on our hands with the homework gap. Every student should be able to go to school. Remote learning should be available to everyone. No student should be locked out of the virtual classroom. The FCC should take the E-rate program right now, which is our nation's largest education technology program, and make sure that every school can do things like loan out wireless routers and help students get connected at home. There's nothing stopping us in the law today, and the fact is we did a program just like this on a pilot basis in 2011. We should do it again.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Commissioner Starks, I mentioned already the HEROES Act and all the things we're working on through that bill that is stuck in the Senate right now to boost and meet the moment. How important during the pandemic would it be to pass the HEROES Act or a similar bill to meet the needs of the American people?
Yeah, I have foot stomped the HEROES Act. I think it's tremendous. You know, even just dovetailing on the answers that Commissioner Rosenworcel just gave and your passionate line of inquiry as well. You know, the sliding scale of E-rate means that more money is available for schools with higher percentages of students on free lunch. And so this is incredibly important right now. And this is not just a theoretical matter as well. The Colorado Attorney General just petitioned the FCC to waive the E-rate rules to permit those schools and libraries to offer off-campus broadband connections. I think that has significant merits, and we should take it up.
Thank you, Commissioner Stark. And I urge all of our FCC commissioners, we're in crisis. It's time to meet the moment. Incremental progress won't work. We need to step up with heroic efforts, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Brooks for 5 minutes for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the commissioners for all being here today. Before I get started, I want to remark, based on the anticipated schedule, this is maybe my last meeting of the subcommittee for the year, depending. And I just want to thank all of my colleagues. It's been an incredible honor to work with all of you and to try to ensure that America is connected to the internet in all the ways that modern technology can allow. And I want to thank the committee staff who have really helped educate me about all things 5G, broadband access, media markets, digital privacy, emergency communication, all the incredibly important things that we work on day in and day out. And but I want to thank the commissioners for being here and for your work and for your ongoing efforts to make sure that Americans continue to have internet during this horrible pandemic. I'm pleased to see that we are moving forward with effort, or that you're moving forward with efforts to continue to ensure that the necessary spectrum for 5G is being made available. I was proud to start the 5G caucus with Congresswoman Dingell, and including getting the 3.45 gigahertz band ready for auction so quickly this month. I hope you can continue to identify ways to make more spectrum available for the next generation of cellular networks. It seems clear to me the Commission is doing what it can within the authority delegated to it by Congress to close the digital divide, including by moving ahead to make 200 megahertz of critical C-band spectrum available in a few short months. And so thank you for that. And in addition to improving the efficiency of the Universal Service Fund program by listening to experts and economists, the FCC has moved regulatory underbrush to make way for the next generation 5G infrastructure, which is critical in what is happening with the race with 5G around the world. I am concerned, Commissioner O'Reilly, I want to ask you, as China continues to try and undermine our networks and they are leading in development of next gen technologies, how important is it that we keep the C-band auction on track to deploy 5G here in the US first? Commissioner O'Reilly?
It's absolutely critical. I would have liked to have had it done earlier, but I'm glad that we're sticking to the schedule and the chairman's set up for December.
And so recently, the FCC adopted the 5G upgrade order to breathe new life into the old bipartisan law, make it easier to upgrade existing wireless infrastructure with more capacity and new 5G antennas. How will this action help consumers who may be using more mobile data than ever before to get through the pandemic? How is that going to help?
Well, look, this is about macro towers, and we're going to need macro towers, not just micro towers going forward and small cells. So this is very important. Commissioner Carr has led the effort on this one, so I might have to defer to him on this point.
Okay, Commissioner Carr, any comment you want to make?
Well, I think Commissioner O'Reilly is exactly right. We need to upgrade thousands of towers across rural America that might have 3G, 4G, or 2G to 5G. And this reform is going to enable us to do that. And I saw some of those communities when I was with you out in Indiana. And so we got to continue to press forward. This is one reform that's going to make a difference.
How will the 5G upgrade order help make more broadband capacity available for low-income Lifeline subscribers who need this capacity now more than ever? And I do want, American citizens to realize that Lifeline capacity is there, or that Lifeline program is there. Commissioner Carr?
This reform is going to, plus others, are going to enable the quick upgrade of service. So communities that don't have high-speed service today can get high-speed service, get connected to our Lifeline programs. So I think it goes together.
Thank you. As one of the 26 infrastructure bills to close the digital divide, which actually I know Republican members of our committee have proposed to help respond to the pandemic, I introduced HR 7334, the Broadband Deployment Streamlining Act. And so, Commissioner, maybe O'Reilly, what has the FCC done to improve coordination across federal government property in responding to COVID-19 pandemic to keep Americans connected? Because so much often, particularly with Western states, needs to go against federal government property.
This has been a longstanding project for mine in the past life and when I worked in Congress. I would say that there's a heavy lift that we have to do. There's not much jurisdiction for the commission, but we do have coordination with our federal agency partners on this. And I think the chairman or Commissioner Carr can probably add to that.
Chairman?
Well, Congresswoman, first, I just want to say thank you for your service to the Congress, to the country. I had a chance to see you in action here in Washington and in your district, and the same with Congressman Flores and Walden. you're true leaders, especially on these issues, and I want to salute your public service and wish you all the best in the next phase of the adventure. Overall, if you look at our regulatory reforms, they are all tailored to boosting the business case for any company to deploy infrastructure, offer lower cost, more innovative services. And that's going to be the case when it comes to 5G, fixed broadband, you name it. So the future is very bright thanks to our reforms that are consistent with the ones that you've been touting for a long time.
Gentlemen, this time has expired. Also, I'd like to say, Ms. Brooks, you have been a great member of this committee, and I also thank you for your service and wish you well in all your future endeavors.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. I wanted to ask Commissioner Rosenworcel a question. Mentioning a town in my district, Metuchen, it's a suburban town in Middlesex County in my district, has about 14,000 people. It's about 20 minutes from the shore. A number of folks in Metuchen get internet service provided from their cable company. And this year, just before the pandemic hit, we started hearing from residents in Metuchen that this company's prices were, in some instances, doubling. And we saw reports that the service was increasingly unreliable. And problems like these in Metuchen are happening all over the country. But instead of trying to make broadband more affordable and protect consumers, I'm afraid that the FCC under Republican leadership has focused on advancing corporate interests, as I said in my opening statement. So I wanted to ask Commissioner Rosenworcel, has the FCC done anything at all to address internet affordability in the last 4 years? And what more could have been done to ensure that people who want and need internet service can afford it?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. Regrettably, the answer is no. We just haven't done enough to address affordability. The truth is, our nation's digital divide has two components. We've got a deployment problem that most often affects rural America, and we've got an adoption problem. And that adoption problem is typically about affordability. But in our broadband reports that we put out year after year, we ignore affordability, we ignore adoption. We're never going to solve our nation's digital divide without doing more to address it, just like you described.
Well, thank you. Let me ask Commissioner Starks. I've heard stories that internet speeds for families with multiple kids just aren't keeping pace. And the FCC has said since the Obama administration that 25.3 is fast enough to be considered broadband. But I don't know, that just doesn't seem right to me. So I just wanted to ask Commissioner Starks, have you heard these reports and do you think the 25.3 service is sufficient?
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. And as you said, when entire families are stuck at home, parents need to telework, students need to virtually teleeducate. I don't believe that 25.3 is enough. And I have met with folks across the spectrum and ecosystem with regard to education, from HBCU presidents to students to administrators at a number of schools. And they have told me that the standard is not meeting the bandwidth needs of the families that they're dealing with and folks that are virtually dialed in. The other thing that I would say here is that I just simply don't believe that 25.3 is future-proof. And that is the standard, of course, that we're building to with the $20 billion in RDOF. And I think ultimately that's going to be a mistake. And 10 years from now, we're going to look back and say that 25.3 is insufficient.
Well, thanks. I'm going to go back to, I know that some members have already talked about this. I came in when Darren Soto was talking about it, but I've said many times that Congress should provide federal funds right now to expand and make affordable internet service during the pandemic. But since the Senate refuses to bring up our HEROES Act passed in the House, the American people are left looking to the FCC to act. So I know this was covered, but if you just would maybe emphasize a little more, I'll start with Commissioner Starks. Has the FCC used the Lifeline program to its full capacity to connect people during the pandemic? And well, let me see if we have time, but maybe that's all I have time for. Commissioner Starks?
Yes, thank you again, Mr. Chairman. And again, affordability is going to be an important aspect of this that obviously is in the HEROES Act. But we have over 50 million Americans that have filed for unemployment. And only 20% of Americans that are eligible for Lifeline actually sign up for the program. We need to better make sure that it meets the moment. And there are a couple of ideas that I have said, a number of which folks have agreed with. We need to enter into MOUs with agencies that administer the program. Make sure that if you are having food insecurity, you are likely having digital insecurity. So we need to have a connection between SNAP and Medicaid and make sure that those people are notified of the Lifeline program. We need to better advertise for the program. Local broadcasters have said that they are battling during the pandemic. We should use US dollars to make advertisements more available. I think it's a win-win. The last thing that I would say, of course, is that the 1,000 minutes and the 3 gigs that is offered under the program is very anachronistic. It is out of date. It's out of touch. It's got to be updated. And we've got to make sure that it meets the moment for millions of Americans that are struggling.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Doyle.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Wahlberg for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Members, if you will hold 1 second, Tim. Remind members, we're not going to recess during votes. There's plenty of time for voting, so depending on your line up in the queue, go down and make your vote and come on back. Okay, Tim, I'm sorry, you're recognized for 5 minutes now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for clarifying that as well. And thanks to the panel for being here. I appreciate this. This would be, I think, much better if we were doing it in person. I know some of you are willing to come and be here in person. It's hard to stomach a little bit, with all due respect to Mr. Chairman, some of the comments of our colleagues that talk about the FCC needed to show some heroism at this point in time, when in fact we won't even show up and have a hearing up close and personal, where I think would be much better, where we could have some give and take, and in fact not step on each other's responses. And for that reason, I want to give Commissioner Carr an opportunity to set the record straight. So let me yield some time to him right now, ask him to set the record straight on the mapping issue.
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate it. I was disappointed to see the previous exchange. It was either said or suggested that this fall we are spending $16 billion on bad maps, and there was information provided about how bad those maps are, suggesting that we're using those this fall. That is false. The maps that we're using this fall, the phase 1 maps, are correct. The difficulties, the problems are with the phase 2 maps, which we're dealing with in the future. So we've had the same exchange before in other committee hearings, so I was disappointed to see that falsity trotted out once again.
Yeah, well, thank you. I want to make sure that was clarified, because
if I might,
those are the facts. Pardon?
And if I might, Congressman, add, the other critical piece of that is that this Congress took away our funding source. They prohibited us from relying on USAC to create the maps, and they've denied us the funding to do the critical back-end IT work to actually get the maps started. So, we warned about this 411 days ago. Nothing has happened.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that as well. And I might add as well that the HEROES Act was never intended to be successful. It was a messaging issue, and we all know that. Chairman Pai, I just want to report to you, since you visited my district and we looked at some of the rural broadband expansion, thankfully, that was taking place as a result of doing away with that misnamed and hurtful net neutrality. My district now, which has tremendous amount of rural space, has much more rural broadband actually up and functioning. In fact, I couldn't have functioned during the shutdown unless that had happened, because I had no rural broadband either until just shortly before this all happened. So it's working, it's up and moving. The expansion has taken place. It came from the west of Michigan to the east of Michigan finally, as a result of the reason for investing and moving it forward. So I just want to report that to you and thank you that it's taken place. Let me ask Chairman Pai and Commissioner O'Reilly if you'd respond as well, to set the record straight as well. It seems like the Democrats have ignored the things you have done and slammed you for the things you can't do. Can the FCC unilaterally expand its E-rate program to deliver connectivity or devices off the school premises, or is that something Congress should need to authorize?
Appreciate the question, Congressman. The statute is clear. It is limited to classrooms. And so that's why early on, I asked Congress for authorization and funding for a remote learning initiative. We can't stray beyond the terms of the statute, but we have done what we could in terms of relaxing gift rules and the like, to make sure that schools can solicit and providers can deliver to different types of connectivity solutions. Additionally, we've been working with the Department of Education to make sure the $16 billion that Congress made available through the CARES Act to DOE can be used by governors and by local school districts for connectivity. We're now seeing governors from Oklahoma to Delaware, the mayor of Washington, D.C., using that funding for that purpose.
Commissioner Riley?
Yes, Congressman, I'm sorry that my colleagues have this opinion. We cannot use that statute for that purpose. The language in the statute is pretty clear. It actually is something that I worked on and I'm very familiar with. We had lots of debates after it was implemented and through the year. So I'm sorry it can't be used for this purpose. There has this argument been made that it was done as a pilot program during Hurricane Katrina. Two wrongs don't make a right. I disagree with its use at that time. And it's just not available for this purpose. And I would happily implement any legislation that Congress enacts on this, but we can't use that provision.
Why is that message still being given out? Why are the other commissioners pointing that out?
Well, I think there was this pilot program that was used wrongfully, in my opinion, and they're looking for all avenues to solve a problem that I understand and rightfully want to work on as well. But that's something that has to be done in Congress.
Well, that doesn't move us forward by putting out misinformation and trying to make it appear like this is a political thing. It's not. We all want connectivity. We all know that we're not there yet. We're expanding that direction. We need to achieve it. And especially as we're going to see more and more people flee the cities under the terrible mismanagement of the Democrat administrations in those cities, we're going to need more of this in the rural areas. And I'm hoping that common sense prevails. Having said that, I yield back.
I let the committee know that I'm standing in for the chair as he votes. So the chair recognizes now Representative O'Halloran.
I want to thank the chairman and ranking member and all our commissioners for joining us today. As COVID-19 has threatened our public health and dangerous wildfires continue to ravage homes throughout the western United States, taking many lives with them, the work of the Federal Communications Commission to ensure connectivity to all Americans has never been more critical. When I say all Americans, I mean every American citizen. This idea that 25.3 is appropriate for any American citizen is wrong. The idea that we are the capacity issues are going to be lower in some areas than in others is wrong. We need the idea that we have this type of disparity throughout our process is wrong. We need to look into the future, plan for the future, and allow everybody, businesses, healthcare, education, to have the same abilities as any other area in America. In this Congress alone, landmark legislation has been signed into law to benefit every daily lives of Americans. The Broadband Data Act, the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act, the Pallone-Trune Traced Act. Despite these success stories and implementing work by the FCC, the digital divide continues to hamper distance learning, access to telehealth services, and the ability to work remotely for far too many Americans, and this is a severe injustice. It's troubling to me as somebody that's worked on future planning for part of my life to look at us trying to make up for the past mistakes and having this hurdle to get over to allow every American to have the same abilities. Commissioners Sparks and Rosenworcel, I firmly believe broadband infrastructure investments must be paired with programs to expand the adoption of broadband among underserved populations in inner cities and rural America alike. I was proud to introduce the bipartisan Broadband Adoption and Opportunity Act with Congressman Johnson, which requires the FCC to work with NTIA states and stakeholders to develop best practices to increase broadband adoption rates and program support for underserved individuals. Could you each comment on the broadband adaptation policy contributions you believe the FCC and its advisory committees could provide to the development of these best practices for states and localities if my legislation were enacted into law?
Yes, Congressman. I thought your legislation was properly framed, has a three-pronged approach that a lot of us talk about, and that is making sure there's access to affordable, reliable broadband, access to affordable devices, and then following through and making sure that folks are trained and have the skills that they need to safely navigate the internet, empower themselves and their communities. So it hits all 3 points. And I would mention some of the public-private partnerships that are also wrapped up in that legislation is something that I have seen up close and personal with some of my digital opportunity equity recognizees as well that have provided refurbished devices, discounted internet plans. I thought it was a tremendous approach and advancement.
Thank you.
I agree with what my colleague said, and I will just add this. We're never going to solve our nation's digital divide if we think we're only going to do it in Washington. And your legislation and other bills like it that compel us to work at the state, local, and federal level together is the way to make this happen. Our maps in Washington don't reflect the lived experience of people around this country. We got to figure out how we take their know-how, their knowledge, and use it to help solve our digital divide. First, by telling us where service is and is not, and then by helping develop programs in our local communities to make sure everyone gets connected.
Thank you. Commissioner Starks, when the FCC recently released its findings from its supply chain information collection proceeding, it underscored the vast quality of suspect network equipment present in domestic networks, including by providers in my district, and estimated the total cost to RIP and replace its equipment. By the same token, the Commission recently held its forum on 5G Open Radio Access Networks, Open RAN, which examined the potential for secure, cost-effective, and domestically produced network equipment that can catapult rural broadband expansion, increase access to 5G services, and support network resiliency. As we prepare to appropriate funding, I guess to get
The gentleman's time has expired. Would the commissioner just have a quick answer?
I think there's a quick answer, Madam Chair, but I will say this. This is an indication of what type of service we get in rural America. I couldn't hear what some of the answers that are going on, and I'm looking at the cell tower right now. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Congressman. Briefly, I think ORAN is going to be an important part of our future, making sure that we capitalize on our leadership in software and wireless technology. And so ORAN holds tremendous promise.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Let me see. The chair now recognizes Mr. Gianforte for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Chairwoman. I'd like to start by thanking the whole commission for your work on ending illegal robocalls. While our efforts against robocalls will continue as technology changes, the efforts we have made are showing real results. Thank you for that. I also commend the commission for working towards our goal of establishing 988 as a national suicide hotline. Unfortunately, Montana has the highest suicide rate in the country, and we have more than 600,000 Montanans that live in an area where there's a shortage of mental health professionals. The current crisis has highlighted the need to get 988 up and running as soon as possible, and I'll continue to push my colleagues to pass H.R. 4194 and Senate Bill 2661, the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act. Commissioner Pai, speaking of telehealth, I was pleased to see the commissioners focus on expanding telehealth at the beginning of the pandemic. Unfortunately, even as rural as Montana is, we did not receive any of those funds. I'd just like to hear from you what steps we can take to make sure Montana's eligible for any future fund distributions.
Well, thank you for your question, Congressman. And in particular, I want to salute you for your focus on 988. The suicide rate in this country is at epidemic levels even before the pandemic. This is more critical than ever. So thank you for your leadership and for standing up for those who are struggling. In terms of telehealth, I did want you to know that among the recipients of the funding that we got in the COVID-19 telehealth program did include some providers outside of the state of Montana who are providing service to 12 facilities in Montana. And again, get you the specific facilities that those are. But basically, in a nutshell, what we did was to establish neutral criteria in terms of, for example, how hard hit a particular state or area was, and among other things, and then allow flexibility to healthcare providers to meet the need in that area. So if Congress sees fit to give us additional funding, I've asked for $430 million additional dollars, given how successful the program is. I would hope that Montana and other states that have the need to broaden telehealth offerings will be able to get it.
Well, thank you, Chairman. And again, Montana being as rural as it is, and with our mental health crisis that we have, I just encourage you to prioritize it. Ensuring access to quality health care has always been a priority of mine, especially for Montanans that live in rural regions. We've seen how the COVID pandemic has impacted Americans' ability to travel to their doctors to receive care. Mr. Chairman, what steps is the Commission taking to make more spectrum available for life-saving technologies like telehealth, not just for urban areas, but particularly for our rural ones?
We've made a lot of steps. The key fun factor is the usefulness of that spectrum in rural areas. So, for example, when it comes to licensed spectrum, recently the 2.5 gigahertz tribal priority window closed. This will give rural tribes an ability to get the spectrum for free without having to bid in an auction. And I can tell you that having recently seen these applications, we do have some tribes in Montana that are serving some very remote parts of the state, looking to serve it using the spectrum, and that is going to be critical for telehealth. Even on the unlicensed side, we've made available 1200 megahertz in the 6 gigahertz band. Fixed wireless providers, WISPs as they're called, can use the spectrum, again, for free to connect a healthcare provider and a patient wherever he or she happens to live. So whether you're in Billings or the Absaroka Wilderness, our vision is for people to get access to healthcare wherever they happen to be, as opposed to having to drive for a couple of hours potentially to see a physician.
Okay. Well, I don't have to remind the Commission that the internet is a lifeline for our rural communities. It contributes to our economies, enabling precision agriculture, education, healthcare, and jobs. And this crisis has highlighted the ability for folks to work from anywhere, yet 2 in 5 Montanans in our rural areas lack access to broadband. Commissioner O'Reilly, I introduced the Standard Fees to Expedite Evaluation and Streamlining Act to establish a common fee for processing applications to deploy communications facilities on federal property. It's one of 26 infrastructure bills to close the digital divide introduced by Republicans on this committee. The FCC has done a lot in this space. What are the top challenges you face as you look at further deployment?
Okay, it's 2 parts. One is on the fee side, and you highlighted on fees on federal property, and on the other side, it's on the process, the ability of local governments or the federal agencies to be able to process applications in a timely manner. We've tackled both. Commissioner Carr, has taken lead on these things, but they certainly have moved forward and been aggressive. And in cases I've made clear, we're going to have to preempt if we don't get better cooperation, because getting broadband out to all Americans is our key priority.
Okay. Well, thank you. My time. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman, he yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Matsui for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the last several weeks, more than 700 wildfires have been burning throughout California, including the second and third largest in our state's history. These extreme weather events, like the fires on the West Coast, hurricanes in the South, and flooding in the Midwest, are becoming more and more common. I introduced the Emergency Reporting Act to ensure the FCC responds adequately and swiftly to major emergencies by conducting field hearings, issuing reports, and making policy recommendations. Commissioner Rosenwald, so just a quick yes or no, do you believe the FCC's response to emergencies have been inconsistent in the past, and do you see value in establishing baseline reporting requirements?
Answer is yes and yes.
Okay. The Emergency Reporting Act would also require the FCC to update its rules that require carriers to alert 911 centers of network outages so they can take action. Commissioner Rosenwalzer, do you see a need to improve 911 centers' situational awareness during emergencies like the California wildfires? And what information would help the most?
Thank you. We call 911 when we have a disaster, when the unthinkable occurs. You need to know that you can reach out. I think the FCC last updated its policies for this in 2012 following the derecho storm in the mid-Atlantic. And I think we've got to figure out how we bring them up to speed and up to date right now so that everyone can call 911 in a crisis, wildfire or otherwise.
Thank you. Because of the fast-moving nature of wildfires in California, residents have relied on emergency notifications to evacuate. Without these life-saving notifications, families are at risk of being caught unprepared as fires rapidly advance toward their city. There have been alarming reports, including from the Yolo County in my district, that these emergency alerts are not getting to consumers. A public safety official from Yolo County recently revealed that 100% of the voice communication tactics did not go through. Commissioner Rosenwalzer, what role can the FCC play in promoting the accuracy and reliability of emergency alerts?
Thank you for the question. We absolutely can do more. In recent years, we have updated wireless emergency alerts so that they're more geo-targeted and that the messages can be longer. That's good. But now what we need to do is study their use after every disaster to understand what went wrong so we can fix it going forward.
Thank you. I understand that the Lifeline minimum monthly data standards are scheduled to change significantly before the end of the year. We all want Lifeline recipients to get the best service possible, but I'm concerned that the automatic increases set to take effect in just a few months could disrupt service for many beneficiaries rather than improve it, or even lead to people paying high prices for monthly service that is currently subsidized for them. Commissioner Starks, do you have concerns at rushing to impose standards in the Lifeline program without necessary data to make informed decisions could have negative consequences for consumers?
I absolutely do. I could not agree more with you, Congresswoman. And if we don't study these issues, I do fear a world where so many Americans are struggling, but would be forced to have a copay or something where they have to come out of pocket. And that would be devastational to me.
Absolutely. And Commissioner Starks, do you believe the FCC should consider economic conditions, especially in light of COVID-19, when evaluating whether or not to start requiring monthly copayments?
The economics of individuals, or I'm sorry.
Yes.
I don't. As I've said before, we don't in particular ask folks that are on Medicare how much they value their service. I think it is anathema to ask folks how much they value their Lifeline phone when we know how much those phones provide in terms of connecting to healthcare, connecting to jobs, connecting to family. And that is where I feel deeply.
Okay. Congress provided the FCC with $200 million to support telehealth through the CARES Act. While those who received funding, including people in my district, were able to expand services during a critical point in the pandemic, significant concerns are raised about the FCC's process and general lack of transparency. Commissioner Rosenwalzer, I have just a short amount of time. Given the experience of the COVID-19 telehealth program, are there additional safeguards or policies you think are important for Congress to consider?
Yes, I think going forward, you should make sure programs like this provide relief to every state. 3 states were left out, and those are 3 states with rising levels of coronavirus. So I think that's important to consider going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes, Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Pai, you know, as this pandemic has highlighted, far too many Americans still do not have access to reliable high-speed internet. And despite the best attempts by Democrats and socialists around the world, you simply cannot mandate a broadband connection for every citizen simply by regulating it. While the challenges are long-standing, you have taken steps under your chairmanship to make record-setting funding available to deploy broadband across this country. Unfortunately, not all FCC commissioners agree. Commissioner Rosenworcel actually stated we rushed billions of dollars out the door in what feels like a broadband publicity stunt without taking a broad view of what the nation needs. So, Chairman Pai, here's my question to you. First of all, do you view the 20.4 billion going toward broadband deployment as a publicity stunt? And what are you doing? What steps are you taking under RDOF to make sure that this funding is going to areas that will actually connect Americans to broadband?
Appreciate the question, Congressman. And the answer to the question is no, it's not a publicity stunt at all. Unlike the Obama stimulus, which poured billions of dollars down the drain and led to a Politico article called Wired to Fail, which I would commend to your attention, this FCC has focused on delivering value, targeting unserved parts of the country, using a reverse auction to ensure financial responsibility, instituting accountability to make sure providers who get the money do what they say they're going to do at the requisite time frameworks. And so we are going to make sure that this RDOF, when it starts on October 29th, and every day therefore, provides access to those who have been for too long on the wrong side of the digital divide. And I also would appreciate, I would note that I appreciate your support for moving ahead now. What you've heard from some, including some at the FCC, is that we should do absolutely nothing on phase one unless the maps are perfect. Essentially what that's saying is, unless we know every part of the country, we shouldn't move ahead with broadband in places like Marietta, unless we know that the suburbs of Murrysville, Pennsylvania, or McLean, Virginia are partially served, unless we get exactly right. To me, people who are on the wrong side of the digital divide, who we know are on the wrong side of the digital divide, have waited long enough for digital opportunity. So I'm proud of the RDOF efforts we've done and the other efforts. We're going to keep plowing ahead, make sure those folks get connected, especially during this pandemic.
All right, well, thank you very much. And Commissioner Rosenworcel, I'm going to use one of Chairman Doyle's techniques here. I need a yes or no answer to this. Do you think it's in the public interest at this moment in time to get the first phase of this rural broadband funding that can connect more Americans out the door?
The answer is yes, but I do
Okay,
not
great.
believe
Thank
that
you
the
very much.
intent
Commissioner
allows
O'Reilly,
people out the door.
Commissioner O'Reilly, as one of 26 infrastructure bills introduced by committee Republicans, I introduced the Wireless Broadband Competition and Efficient Deployment Act to remove the requirement to prepare an environmental or historic preservation review for co-locations of wireless facilities. So Commissioner O'Reilly, would eliminating this requirement for this type of review where wireless capability is already co-located, would that, eliminating that, help Americans, particularly children forced to distance learn, to get connected more quickly?
Absolutely, yes, and I endorse your bill.
Okay, great, thanks. Chairman Pai, I'd like to commend you for the hard work that you've done to ensure America remains a world leader in communications and technology, and for your work to cut red tape at the FCC and make government work more efficiently for Americans and American businesses. My colleagues have spoken at length about your work to help American companies lead in 5G wireless. But I'd like to talk about another spectrum-dependent technology where U.S. companies are already the gold standard, and that's radar systems. As the Commission works to make mid-band spectrum available for 5G, how are you ensuring that the changes you're making continue enabling our leading American companies to have reliable access to that spectrum to test their products that result in major U.S. export and U.S. jobs?
That's a great question, Congressman. When I started, the cupboard was bare in terms of mid-band spectrum. We had nothing on tap, certainly nothing in the pipeline. And so we started from scratch, and we've now enabled up to 600 megahertz to be repurposed for mid-band 5G. At the same time, we recognize there are important incumbent interests, including radars, that we need to accommodate. And so I've worked closely, our team has worked very closely with the Department of Defense, with other federal agencies to make sure that as we transition some of the spectrum fully to 5G or share it with 5G enabled services, that we are making sure that those radar systems, some of which of course defend our country and serve very important purposes, will be able to be maintained. So you have to balance those interests in these bands as well as any other band, and we've been able to do that so far.
All right, well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, thanks. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. He yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Escher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. And to all of the commissioners, thank you for being with us today. I want to share a story with you, and it's a real life story. Let me describe what my district is going through. You know about the fires. The one that hit my district called the Silicon Valley District. 77,000 evacuees. Over 1,000 homes lost. Connections lost. People are desperate. Nothing is working for them. Thank God for all of the first responders, law enforcement, all the teams, federal, state, local, and the work that they did. To the chairman of the commission, you're missing in action. Where have you been? Why don't you come to California? Why don't you meet with people in these resource centers and meet with those that are cannot connect to anything? You have to be with people to understand what they're going through. Now, in March, well, actually, in 2009, 11 years ago, California asked the FCC to share cell tower outage data because, as you know, states are the ones that respond to the disasters, and they need to know if people can't call 911 or receive emergency alerts. In March, you reissued the rulemaking to get more information rather than acting. The FCC has had a decade of comments from every single stakeholder. So, you know, in all of this, it reminds me of a long ago trade agreement, the GATT, G-A-T-T. This is what I'm hearing is like a gentleman's agreement to talk and talk. You haven't taken action. This information could save lives. So, Commissioner Rosenworcel, are there any technical, legal, or really any reasons that the FCC can't start sharing outage information with states, knowing the critical importance of this?
As long as it's done confidentially, there's no reason why we can't share it with our state counterparts. And as you said, Congresswoman, it could save lives.
Well, Chairman Pai, what are you going to do? Are you going to keep talking about it? Or are you going to take action?
I appreciate the question, Congresswoman, and more importantly, I appreciate the plight of those in your district who are suffering through the wildfires. As you noted, this issue languished during the Obama administration.
Just give me a yes or no, because I have other things that I want to bring up. Are you going to take action on this? And if so, when?
We put out an NPRM, as you know, and we plan to move to an order soon. And we will share that information, unlike the previous administration.
When?
I can't give you a specific time frame, but we plan to move forward soon.
Well, you know what? If you held elective office, they would boo you out of a town hall meeting, because this is about people's lives. And I'm not saying this to be disrespectful to you. We are in bad shape. And it's about agencies working, understanding what's taking place in people's lives. Otherwise, FCC doesn't mean a damn thing to people unless you take action so that the actions can walk into people's lives. I don't sense an urgency on these issues, and I'm sorry to say that, and it's a great source of frustration. Now, Mr. Chairman, about 48 hours ago, happily, after I first wrote to you 1,231 days ago about RT and Radio Sputnik, you did something about it. So I thank you for that. But it's about 46 days before the election. So it's late, but I thank you for doing it. Have you contacted the intelligence community to apprise them of it? That's my only question on that.
I'll check with the team. I know that we have been working with federal
Well, it's very important that they do. This is a check with the team. You need to get on the phone with the intelligence community and inform them of this decision, because it's the intelligence community that fingered these outfits as being complicit in putting out propaganda to the American people. So this isn't this is not small potatoes. So
Second lady's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will submit my other questions for the record and ask that all of the communications on RT and Sputnik be placed in the committee's record. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. She yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Houston, Texas, whose Texans took a real beating in Kansas City, and I'm just expressing my sympathy. I see Chairman Pai is happy about that result, but don't hold that against him, Pete. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. My dear friend from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Mike Cosine Renfro Doyle. Welcome to our witnesses. We appreciate your expertise, your time. Y'all have felt a lot of pressure the past couple of years on broadband access, on spectrum auctions, but you ain't seen nothing yet, all because of COVID-19. A few examples why we all know a way of life has changed dramatically because of this virus. As Commissioner Stark said, most public schools in my district are working now online. They've been in school for 3 weeks now. They're transitioning to combination online in the schools, and that's determined by the parents. They took a vote to the parents. About half said go to school, about half said I want to keep them at home. That's a big change. That demands a lot of access to broadband. Also, a lot of my neighbors, they're working from home, and they've been cleared to work from home until 2001. That's a lot more stress on the broadband. And also a lot of stress for telemedicine. And things have been amazing with telemedicine during this crisis, pandemic crisis. One example is a local hospital system in Houston called Kelsey-Seybold. I talked to CEO Tony Lynn. He told me they had some savings in 2005. They invest that, see in the future, in telemedicine for their entire system. You want to go see your doctor, you live across town, just go to local Kelsey-Seybold clinic, you're online with him. He said it wouldn't bite. The doctors thought it was quack medicine. I got to see the patients, got to look at their eyes, touch them. I can't watch it on TV. So Tony was frustrated because for about 15 years, 83% of their visits were still to the clinics. 17 went telemedicine. 10 days in March 15th through March 25th, that flipped. 83% going to telemedicine, only 17 going to see their doctors. But again, that's a big burden on our broadband network. And I want to join Chairman Pallone. He said, I quote, accurately mapping the availability of broadband access service across America is essential to promote the development of high-speed service to Americans living in unserved and underserved areas. We all know that access to broadband and technology and that they can use, kids mostly in poor neighborhoods, communities, minorities, on tribes, rural America, they'll lose access and fall behind. So my question for you, Mr. Chairman Pai, is what steps have you taken to coordinate with groups like the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the NTIA, to utilize their data going forward to develop this broadband network that we have to have? It's not just you, it's a team, correct?
That's absolutely right, Congressman. And if I may, let me just salute you as well for your service in Congress. I know that this might be your last House ENC hearing. It's been a pleasure to work with you. And even though I let you down by not climbing a tower during your terms in office, nonetheless, I want to wish you the very best in the time to come. In terms of—
Chairman Carr showed us both up, my friend. He showed us up.
Like I said, these young kids are able to do much more than I am. But in terms of the maps, though, we have indeed worked with the NTIA and with other stakeholders, including on the state level, to make sure we're getting as much information as we can. And in the context of RDOF in particular, worked with state agencies on where they have programs that may already be underway. So it's a joint effort. We're all in it together. And our end goal, as you pointed out, is to make sure we have the most accurate, granular maps we can.
Commissioner Rowley, you made some comments about that as well. You'd like to talk about the coordination with other agencies to get this network built out. It's not just the FCC's responsibility.
Look, I'm hopeful that the coordination is going well. My past experience suggests it hasn't been that way. I'm hopeful that it will improve going forward. We have to make sure that other agencies, that as our data improves, that they rely on it, that they not go their own path, that we actually have some coordination. And I haven't been, in the past, it hasn't gone that way, and we'll just have to see and trust going forward.
I'm about out of time, so I want to pay a tribute to you, Commissioner O'Reilly. And this comes from my heart, the heart of Houston, Texas, and the heart of Chairman Mike Brentford Doyle. It comes from the oldest coach, Bum Phillips, the great wisdom of Bum Phillips. He'd say, Commissioner Mike O'Reilly, you may not be in a class by yourself, but whatever class you're in, it don't take long to call the roll. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and Pete, I just want you to know that I'm going to miss talking sports with you and miss passing legislation with you. You have been a great, great member of this committee, and I know we all wish you well in whatever you do in the future. And I know next time you play them Kansas City Chiefs, you guys will beat them. Okay, now
I've got your home phone number and email address, Mike. I'm not leaving.
There you go. Chair now recognizes Mr. Cardenas for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing on the Trump's FCC, 4 years of lost opportunities. Wow. I've been vocal about ownership rules since I was first elected because I care about diverse voices in the media. I care about local stories and news being accessible to all Americans. We're dealing with several crises at once. Wildfires raging in my home state of California and across the West, a pandemic, police brutality and racial injustice and racial violence. Local voices in news and media are more important than ever. The landscape in which we digest news may be changing, but for many folks in my district, over the air is still how they receive local news, local weather, and emergency alerts. Some broadcasters do an outstanding job covering communities, but more often than not, they have a presence in the community in which they're broadcasting to. The chipping away of media ownership rules has led to consideration of broadcasters like Sinclair, which has greatly expanded its reach and power to bring a one-size-fits-all biased package to our TV throughout America. We're exposed to so much content from different platforms and mediums from all over the world. Broadcasters are our connection to the community. Now more than ever, we need local voices to come through, from news to stories to music, to get us through these times and to keep us informed. Commissioner Rosenworcel, we have seen ownership rules rolled back consistently in the last 4 years with the blessing of the Trump administration. Can you talk about the effect this has on communities like mine in Los Angeles?
Sure. Thank you for asking the question, because local news is so vital for our democracy. And we need it in order to make decisions about our lives, about our families, and about our communities. But the challenge is that we've allowed so much concentration to increase, and at the same time, we've seen radical decreases in the number of jobs in journalism. And that has real consequences. We need local news. We need facts to make decisions about our communities, our lives, our country. And I'm afraid that concentration has hurt our ability to do so, not helped.
Commissioner Rosenworcel, one of my colleagues mentioned your comments about the $24 billion publicity stunt. Can you concisely remind us what you meant by that?
What I meant is that the FCC wants to do work on broadband, but we haven't improved our data. And using data we know is wrong, we will be giving out $16 billion a week before the election. And that $16 billion represents 80% of our funds for broadband for the next 10 years. To me, that feels less like policy and more like stunt, and that's regrettable.
I agree with you. That is a stunt, and it's a very expensive one in so many ways, not just in dollars, but in the quality of life and the ability for us to continue as a democracy. Another issue I want to address is the Lifeline program. It's been dropping from 10.4 million subscribers in December of 2016, and now it's down to 6 million in March of 2020. Commissioners Rosenworcel and Starks, what do you think are the biggest reasons for the program's decline, even while the percentage of Americans living in poverty has stayed relatively consistent? Can you comment?
I would just say that our approach towards Lifeline has been cruel from front to back. We've made it an agency goal to cut at this program, and in the process, we have cut lots of Americans off from the communications they need. And now we're in a crisis, and shame on us. We should be doing everything we can to rebuild this program and make sure more households can stay connected to the communications they need in this crisis.
Yes, I would also add, thank you for the question, Congressman. You know, the national verifier stumbled out of the starting blocks and has continued now. Only 18 states have SNAP connected as an automated data source. And so what that means is that otherwise you have a manual review of Lifeline applications. When you go to that manual review, a lot of folks, it's much slower. A lot of folks make mistakes, and the rejection rate, the error rate is significantly higher. And so we've got to do better in making sure that the most vulnerable get connected to the Lifeline services that we know they need.
Okay, well, hopefully this commission can take some better leadership on that. I want to turn now to a more positive, unanimous, talking about the unanimous steps that have been taken by the commission to free more unlicensed spectrum in the 6 gigahertz band. It all sounds very technical, but Commissioner Starks, can you explain what this decision means for American consumers, particularly in the new normal virtual world we're in today?
And let's do it briefly because the gentleman's time has expired. So briefly,
yes,
Commissioner.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this decision is a big win for consumers, especially will help the millions of Americans who can't afford that home broadband connection and rely on public Wi-Fi. And I have visited a number of homeless shelters where I heard specifically from folks that are relying on Wi-Fi. I think this will help and really make a real benefit to everyday Americans.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chair now recognizes Mr. Kinzinger for 5 minutes, Adam.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and everybody. Thanks for sort of being here, I guess. But I just want to make mention what other people have said too. It really is amazing how well all the networks have held up during this. Something we never saw coming. Kind of interesting. If this would have happened 5 years earlier, I'm not sure we would have been able to follow through and govern, frankly, like this as well. So to all of you, you get credit for that, and I appreciate your hard work. Mr. Chairman, I know this has been an interesting hearing, but we talk a lot about
Adam, we can't hear you.
We can see you, Adam, but we can't hear you. We can see you, but we can't hear you.
Right. We cannot hear you. Perhaps we'll go to someone else and give Adam maybe a chance to get his service back because no one can hear his questions. Who is next up? Mr. Shimkus. Why don't we do you, and then we'll try to get back to Mr. Kinzinger.
Okay, I think my video is starting, but I think the voice is up. Let me also kind of join with what Adam was saying is thank you for the commission. I also agree that there is no way we could have governed had we not tried to deploy and get broadband out. These Zoom calls, these Webexes, shoot, I do stuff with European members from Parliament and the parliamentarians from Montenegro. And it's almost real time. It's really fascinating, and congrats to that. A little bit of lecture time. I'm disappointed. I'm trying to figure out what actually is the title for this hearing. It could be Trump FCC 4 years of lost opportunity. It could be promises made, promises kept, connecting American for future generations. I kind of like the coronation of Jessica. How about Commissioners O'Reilly's farewell and thank you? How to abuse time as the chairman could be one, or how to continue to show America how dysfunctional we really are in DC. Terrible, terrible hearing. We're better than that. The telecommunications subcommittees, there's so much that we do together and so much legislation that we pass together that I'm really disappointed that this could be my last hearing too, and it's it's a cat fight. And so for those of you who can't say it, but kind of feel the same thing, when tables turn, hopefully we mature. I'd like to highlight benefits. And as you and I did 911 emergency communications throughout our whole career, I think Ranking Member Walden raised the first net, and that truck out there in the wildfires, that's a huge success. You know, USDA, rural communication on broadband, big deal that I work with. The FCC has now their own role in connectivity. Shoot, even out the state of Illinois has, and I'm not a big fan of the Illinois state government right now, but they've actually put money in to connect. We are connecting, and we're doing a lot better than we ever had in the past. I think this pandemic has proven that we are better. We're not perfect. We're never going to be perfect, but that's my diatribe. I wanted to get a question out to Commissioner Carr because of 5G and deployment and my SPEED Act, which may come out in the second RPM. Can you talk about where we're at on 5G? Because I do think that's going to be a key to connectivity to a lot of areas as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for your leadership on this. Those legislative ideas that you flagged, I think, would further accelerate U.S. leadership. The truth is, in 2015 and 2016, we were at serious risk of getting blown away in the race to 5G by China and other countries. Congress stepped up early on. We stepped up at the FCC with infrastructure modernization efforts. And now 5G and other infrastructure builds are accelerating like a hockey stick. And we're seeing 5G builds not just in big cities, but in Defiance County, Ohio, in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So I think those are better marks of the progress we're making from modernized infrastructure rules.
Yeah, and just on a side, the Huawei issue, which was primarily a U.S. issue for the beginning, now is being accepted by the European community. You know, Great Britain is trying to disengage from Huawei. They are the low-cost provider, which hurts kind of my rural providers because they went to Huawei, but it's the right thing to do. And Chairman Pai, with the last minute that I have, can you give that time for you to add to anything else you may want to say?
Well, first, Congressman, thank you for your kind words and importantly for your public service. It's been a pleasure to work with you. And I still have memories of our visit to that PSAP in Harrisonville, Illinois, where we saw some dedicated public servants trying to make the 911 system work in those 16 counties. In terms of the 5G security work, I think Commissioner Carr outlined well some of the steps we've taken. I'll just take the opportunity to personally note that I've been deeply involved both here and abroad in working with our partners in other nations to ensure a shared framework for 5G security. I've personally visited Bahrain, Malaysia, India. I've personally spoken to Belgians and Brazilians and others about the need for a shared framework. And now, along with the State Department, Defense Department, White House, and others, now we're starting to see the fruits of those labors as there's a shared understanding about the risk of equipment and services that are subject to Chinese Communist Party surveillance or jurisdiction. And so I'm hopeful that with those partnerships, with our exploration of open radio access networks, as the FCC is encouraging, we'll be able to see a much stronger and much more secure 5G network than we otherwise would have.
Gentleman's time has expired. I would like to say to my friend John, I know there's days I've felt like you feel today. We've both been on this committee a long time, but I want you to know you're a great member and I consider you a friend. And I wish you all the best in your future endeavors, buddy.
Go Cards. I don't have the Pirate problem. I'm a Cardinal fan.
Worst baseball team in both national and American leagues. I told the Pittsburgh owner that I should coach the Pirates because I could coach a team into last place just as well as the guy there could. But anyways, thank you, John. Chair now recognizes Debbie Dingle for 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle, and all the Chairman Pai and all the commissioners for being here today. And I do have to say, I have the Detroit Tigers and the Detroit Lions, so go blue. But as I start my comments, I do want to say that it was great to be with Commissioner Carr at the University of Michigan, and we learned, talked about what telehealth was doing and how it was transforming what's happening in the schools. We also heard of some challenges, and I've taken back my list. He's taken back his list. And we've really got to work on a number of these things. What I really am concerned about, and my other colleagues have expressed, is what the repeal of net neutrality and deregulation is doing to consumers. The digital divide has been greatly exacerbated in this process. And we continue to see, as we're watching COVID-19 nationwide, there are real problems as our kids are depending upon this. This week, I do a weekly call with all my mayors and elected officials, and people are getting bills from cable companies that they're going over data usage they've never had before. People are scared and there are issues, and we've got to work on all of these. So I would urge the FCC to use all of the tools available that they can right now. We need to do a better job for the American people. But now I want to move to some questions focused on the latest related to the FCC's efforts to reallocate spectrum in the 5.9 GHz band and the rollout of 5G. Let's start by picking up where we left off in December. The 5.9 GHz spectrum band is known as the safety spectrum since it's been dedicated to intelligent transportation systems applications. The band is harmonized globally. Chairman Pai, has the FCC conducted a study to evaluate the impacts that reallocating 45 MHz of the 5.9 GHz band would have on the United States, maintaining global competitiveness in the emerging sector of advanced transportation technology? And please be brief in your response.
Congressman, as you know, all 5 commissioners have agreed on the need to repurpose the spectrum given the failure of DSRC to materialize as originally sought. We're currently studying the appropriate way forward.
Chairman Pai, has the FCC studied the impact of jobs in this sector that could be lost in Michigan, Ohio, and in other parts of the country due to reallocating 45 MHz of the 5.9 GHz spectrum band?
Well, there are many factors that go into our consideration. The first and foremost, of course, is that the automotive industry has not used this spectrum to its fullest extent, if it's used it at all, over the last 22 years. So
it does plan on using it. So as you know, there have been issues. So I think you can't ignore it. In a recent letter to the FCC Office of Engineering and Technology, NTIA proposed exclusion zones be implemented in the 5.9 GHz spectrum band to protect federal operations, including DoD, NASA, and the Department of Energy Systems, prior to the commission finalizing an order. Chairman Pai, has the FCC conducted a study to assess the impacts that reallocating 45 MHz of the 5.9 band, for the 5.9 GHz band for unlicensed operations would have on U.S. national security interests?
Congressman, that's one of the factors that we will take into account. We just got the NTIA letter, so I haven't had a chance to speak to OET about its impact on the.
All right, I care deeply, just in case you didn't know. Finally, the FCC granted wireless internet service providers temporary access to the lower 45 MHz of the 5.9 GHz spectrum band to help them serve rural communities facing an increase in broadband needs during the COVID-19 pandemic. Chairman Pai, does the FCC have data to show that this effort met the needs for broadband? And did the FCC consider whether granting this temporary access to lower 45 MHz of the 5.9 GHz spectrum band would cause harmful interference to ITS operations in the 5.9 GHz band?
The answer to your first question is yes. In fact, we were so surprised at the positive impacts that we put out a report, which we can make available to you, about how certain small internet service providers have used the spectrum very quickly to increase the reach of their networks. Amplex in Lucky, Ohio, other small providers like that. And so I'm really excited about what the use cases that the smaller providers can use to close the digital divide, especially for low income and rural Americans who otherwise wouldn't get access at all.
Well, I care deeply about that digital divide, but I also care about safety as well. Chairman Doyle, I'd like to request unanimous consent to submit for the record a letter sent yesterday to this committee from a coalition of transportation industry stakeholders to express significant concern with efforts underway at the FCC to reallocate spectrum in the 5.9 GHz band away from transportation safety.
Without objection, so ordered. Generally, the time has expired. Mr. Kinzinger.
Let's try it again.
Minutes if we can hear you.
Yeah. How is it now? Is it better?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right. Great. If I lose you, then I'll just say that basically God doesn't want me to do this and we can move on. But Thank you all for being here. It'll be great to see you all in person again when we can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing. Chairman Pai, you know, we talk a lot about the need to make spectrum available for 5G, and China is determined to get ahead of the United States in every form of technology, and will do whatever they need to make it happen. So I was pleased that the White House and the DoD agreed to make 100 megahertz of mid-band spectrum available for 5G, and that the FCC placed this item on the September agenda. So thank you for that. You already answered to Leader Walden that you all oppose a nationalized 5G network, but I want to ask each of the commissioners, and we can start with you, Mr. Chairman. Do you agree that this band can be used at full commercial power as announced by the White House? And if you could just keep it brief.
Yes, I do.
Yes.
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 All right, that's about as close to unanimous as we're going to get. Chairman Pai, you're taking a great first step by moving quickly to auction this spectrum, because we need to get this spectrum to industry quickly if we're going to stay ahead of China. How fast do you plan to bring the 100 megahertz of spectrum to market?
As soon as possible. I mean, we're going to be voting in a couple of weeks on an order essentially repurposing some of the spectrum for 5G. Last year, we already made initial steps for non-federal users. We submitted the notification under the CSEA in June. So we're hopeful that either in late 21 or early 22, we can move ahead with that option, or sooner if there are other steps that can be taken to accelerate that process.
Great. Thank you for that. And obviously, we're here to help if needed. I want to commend the Commission on acting to secure the U.S. supply chain by designating Huawei and ZTE as national security threats to our communications networks. I would hope that even our friends on the other side of the aisle recognize the good work of the Commission on this issue. Even you, Mr. Pallone, you've stated, or Chairman Pallone has stated, we simply cannot allow China and other bad actors to infiltrate our telecom systems. And so there is wide bipartisan agreement on that. Yet even on this crucial bipartisan issue, unfortunately, the House Democrats did not include funding in their HEROES Act, the Partisan HEROES Act, to help small carriers remove Huawei and ZTE. So, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Pai, what have you done or plan to do to help ensure that the U.S. networks are secure?
We've done a lot, Congressman, barred the use of USF funding from being used prospectively on equipment and services. We've also done an inventory of existing equipment, and we've got a list now of some carriers that have problematic equipment from Huawei and ZTE. We've also encouraged the next generation of network architecture known as open radio access networks. We just held a forum on Monday where I personally talked to a lot of experts, as did my fellow commissioners, about these issues. The critical thing now is for Congress to give us funding for to enable these recipients of USF funds to rip out the equipment that's problematic and replace it with more secure equipment. Something I've been pushing Congress to do for several months now. We really need that funding, especially in these smaller rural areas where some of the smaller carriers might not otherwise have the wherewithal to remove the equipment.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, you know, on that issue, education of the public is important. I know you guys are trying to do the best you can. Even things like TikTok, right? Like, why is it that, you know, TikTok is a concern? You know, if I told you, by the way, that the NSA was monitoring some app everybody used, people would go crazy. But for some reason, the concerns about the Chinese government, it's, you know, for most people, not as concerning. So I think information is going to be key to that. And last year, Congress and the FCC took critical steps to crack down on robocalls, which was awesome, something almost every American get behind except robocallers, I guess. Since the implementation, efforts by the FCC to put an end to these unlawful robocalls, we've seen a substantial decline. In May of 2020, they were down 60% compared to May of 2019. And additionally, the FCC proposed a record $225 million fine for 1 billion spoof robocalls. The data shows that this has been successful, but I'm curious to know how these bad actors are adjusting to the new rules and if we need to build on the success with something even stronger. So Commissioner O'Reilly, are these bad actors finding new ways to get around the rules to place robocalls?
Absolutely, they will continue to do so. And I think what you're seeing in the success you mentioned is the fact that we've moved away from penalizing the carriers and going after the bad actors. They will continue to figure out how to manipulate the system and figure out how to continue to conduct fraud. It's our job to keep up with that and make sure that the system works for the best. And we go after the illegal robocalls and protect American citizens.
Okay, and since I'm coming to the end of my time, I won't ask the next question. I'll just thank all of you, whether we all agree on everything or not, for your hard work. I very much appreciate it, and especially on the robocall issues too. If there's anything further that we need to do, to give you the power to continue to crack down on it and see success, let us know. And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back and apologize for the earlier malfunction.
Gentleman yields back, no problem. Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleagues for participating in this committee hearing. And also I want to say special thank you at the end of this session to our 5 FCC commissioners. It's been a pleasure to work with all of you these past 2 years, and I look forward to working with you in the future. I want to take an opportunity to convey to you what's going on in Vermont. Vermont, like Montana, like Iowa, like all of rural America, has an extraordinary challenge with access and availability of internet. And we agree on this committee that rural America must have high-speed internet for health, for work, for education. And we also agree that rural America doesn't have it. About 70,000 households in Vermont don't meet the federal standard of broadband. And we also have incredible challenges with affordability. And I think there's really 2 fundamental questions that the FCC faces and Congress faces. One, will we make the decision that our forebears made in the 1930s that we have to have broadband throughout rural America, much like they decided we had to have electricity everywhere? That was a social decision, not an economic decision. And we have to make that decision, and the other policies to implement it will follow. And second, will our Congress do like our predecessor Congress on electrification and set up opportunities for rural electrification districts now for broadband, which are similar to communication union districts, which we have in Vermont? And what that really raises is the question of what's the role of government. The private sector can be efficient. It can also be cruel. If the private sector wanted to and had an incentive to extend broadband throughout rural Vermont, they would have, but it's not here. What we've done in Vermont with a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature is establish communication union districts where towns come together, 15 or 20 small towns, and set up a district. And the goal is for those districts to provide broadband to the citizens that live within it. And it's a model that works in parts of Vermont already, and it's very similar to rural electrification districts that have worked so well for many folks in rural areas. I want to ask a couple of questions first with Commissioner Rosenworcel. You've been making the point about deployment and adoption, and you joined me on a roundtable involving people from the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. And one of the participants was a teacher who was, or a parent who was sitting in her car, not sitting on a curb outside of a fast food place. It's a little colder up here in Vermont, in order to get access to the internet. And one of the stories she told was not only how difficult it is to get access, but how a little girl said, "We've run out of internet," because she couldn't afford it. What role do you see these union districts, communication districts, playing in the deployment of broadband in rural parts of America to deal with deployment and adoption?
Thank you for your commentary. And I too can't get out of my mind the idea that a student ran out of internet. It really speaks to the crisis we're in right now. They can't go to class because they reached a data cap or don't have service. We got to fix that. And I think we need all ideas on the table, just like you suggested. We have got to go back and look at the Rural Electrification Act and what we did to bring
I can't hear her, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
See you, but we can't hear you.
Commissioner, we're not able to hear you.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes. There's a commercial like that.
Oh, I know, right? I've heard that one. You know, we did it with rural electrification before. We can do it again when it comes to broadband. And we've got to follow those models that we used in the past and make them viable in the future. A little more deregulation is not going to solve our problems. And that's been the FCC's approach to date. And I think it's reached its limits. We need to go back and look at what we did with rural electrification, just like you suggested.
Thank you. I see that my time is up, so I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Lujan for 5 minutes. You need to unmute, Ben. You need to unmute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to submit into the record a report from the American Library Association entitled Built by E-Rate, a case study of 2 tribally owned fiber networks and the role of libraries in making it happen.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, the coronavirus pandemic has exacerbated many longstanding inequities in our country, including the digital divide. According to the FCC, more than 60% of New Mexicans living on tribal lands and more than 50% in rural communities lack access to high-speed fixed broadband. This divide, especially during this pandemic, undermines businesses' ability to thrive, students' ability to learn, workers' ability to telework, and patients' ability to see their doctors. One way we can bridge this divide is by connecting schools, libraries, and community anchor institutions. Commissioner Rosenworcel, you say in your testimony that, quote, we need to incorporate the experience of so many people across the country who can tell us what service looks like where they live and why our maps are wrong. After all, the best broadband map will not be built in Washington. It will be built by all of us. And I agree with you. I agree that it's going to be built by all of the folks that are living in parts of the country where there's no connection. In fact, I often say that my constituents know the difference between fast internet, slow internet, and no internet. That's why I work to include provisions in the Broadband Data Act to help consumers in local, tribal, and state governments meaningfully participate in the collection of broadband data by empowering them to challenge flawed coverage maps. Commissioner Rosenworcel, can you quickly build on your statement, your testimony, and discuss why it's so important that the FCC implement a robust challenge process to determine whether coverage maps are accurate?
Sure. The best part of the Broadband Data Act might in fact be what you're bringing up. The idea that we're going to ask everyday Americans, do you have bars on your phone? Do you have service on your street? Because the truth is, all of us know. We know where service is and service is not in our communities. So we've got to take that know-how and knowledge and use it to inform the official data we have at the FCC. I'm pretty confident that if we use the knowledge of everyday Americans from all across this country, we'll get maps that are far more accurate than what we have right now.
I appreciate that. Commissioner Starks, it is my understanding that the FCC is statutorily required to vote on an item implementing key pieces of the Broadband Data Act, including the challenge process on Monday. Yes or no? Is the FCC on track to do this?
I believe we're not, Congressman.
Chairman Pai, there's a lot of interest in this space. While I understand that information needs to be disseminated to commissioners before it's disseminated publicly, can you make those documents available to this committee as soon as you disseminate them to the commissioners so that we know that all commissioners have that information?
I'm not sure which documents you might be referring to, Congressman, but certainly if it's a meeting item, we always publish that at least 3 weeks in advance.
My concern, Commissioner Pai, is that the FCC is not on track to meet its statutorily requirement on the challenge process for Monday. And it's important that that information not just be given to the commissioner so they know what they're going to be voting on, but this committee has a lot of interest in that space. So I'm hoping that pertaining to that particular vote, you can share those documents with this committee as soon as they've been disseminated to the commissioner so that we know that they've been shared. Commissioner Starks, do you believe that the FCC has done the necessary work to collect accurate data to make smart investments to close the digital divide?
I don't, and I have taken issue with the $20 billion that is set to go out under poor data, flawed data, and I don't believe anybody in this virtual room knows what are the communities, what are the census blocks and tracts that are trapped in this 477 data issue that are not going to ultimately be included in RDOF phase 1. And then, of course, under the mobility fund, the prospect of us using poor data there is something that I absolutely am against as well.
I appreciate that response, Commissioner Starks, and that's a concern that's been raised by many of my constituents that are involved with expanding broadband connectivity across New Mexico, is the importance and the need to fix Form 477. Well, I understand the Commission's looking at this. This needs to be done, and it can be fixed immediately such that communities are not left without because one house in a neighborhood or in a community shows that they have high-speed access, and that excludes everyone else from some of the programs we're putting forth. That's just wrong. Let's fix that. The last question I have, Commissioner Rosenworcel, is, has the FCC done everything it can to connect tribal communities during this pandemic?
Congressman, the answer is no, but I will note favorably that our work on the 2.5 gigahertz band with the chairman is a positive development. There'll be more tribes that have direct access to spectrum as a result, and I hope that that will make a meaningful difference in the future, but we have a lot more work to do.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Chairman.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Butterfield for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for their testimony. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership. You've been nothing less than extraordinary on this committee, and look forward to continuing to work with you in the years to come. In the wake of COVID-19 spread, disparities in maternal health outcomes are deepening. This is particularly true in rural communities like the one that I represent, and among expecting women of color who continue to suffer disproportionately high rates of maternal and infant mortality. Earlier this year, I led a letter joined by 27 other members recommending that the FCC reserve Connected Care pilot program resources for Connected Care projects addressing maternal health care in each state. In addition, earlier this year, I introduced the bipartisan, bicameral Data Mapping to Save Moms' Lives Act. It's kind of a mouthful, along with Representatives Gina Forte, Blunt Rochester, and Congresswoman Brooks. This legislation directs the FCC to use data mapping to identify areas of the country where high rates of poor maternal health overlap with a lack of broadband access. I believe doing so will give us a better understanding of where we should be allocating telehealth resources. And so, Commissioner Rosenworcel, do you agree that the FCC should use its pilot program to address maternal mortality?
Absolutely. The United States is the only industrialized country with a rising level of maternal mortality. And we know that telemedicine solutions could help rural areas and especially women of color who really are suffering right now. We need to do more, and I think our pilot project is a way to start. I appreciate
Let me ask you this.
interest in this issue.
How would a better understanding of where high rates of poor maternal health and a lack of broadband access overlap, how would that aid us in combating the maternal health crisis?
Well, I've had the privilege of spending some time with the doctors at the University of Arkansas, and I've also spent time with maternal experts at the Mayo Clinic, and they both are developing programs that rely on telemedicine. The more that we can connect mothers, the more that we connect pregnant women, the more likely they'll be able to follow up with appointments for small health problems that can turn into disasters when it comes to giving birth. So the connection between broadband, telemedicine, and maternal health is real. I think we should use our pilot project to explore it, just as you said, in every single state.
That's what I wanted to get in the record. Thank you. Commissioner O'Reilly, closing the digital divide is imperative to ensure that all Americans have the access they need for distance learning, for telehealth, for jobs, and a host of other essential activities that increasingly require a broadband connection. However, due to outdated ETC designation requirements, qualified broadband providers are discouraged from participating in FCC programs that increase broadband access for low-income and rural consumers. My Expanding Opportunities for Broadband Deployment Act would retire this outdated restriction. Now, let me ask you this. Do you agree or disagree that eliminating the ETC requirement could help more providers connect more Americans?
I absolutely agree, and I wrote a blog on this, and I support your legislation. I had a blog on this that went through all the different arguments presented on not only why my conversations with so many different providers and why this has discouraged their participation and discouraged their participation in upcoming auctions like RDOF, where they're not willing to edge out in certain circumstances to build out the areas that really need it. And I commend that to your attention and the committee's attention. I think it's so important that we fix this going forward.
Thank you, Commissioner. And finally, to Commissioner Starks, it's good to see you today, Commissioner. It's been a while since we've chatted, but thank you for your extraordinary work. Commissioner, you have been a vocal proponent of the find it, fix it, fund it approach to protect the telecommunications supply chain from high-risk foreign equipment vendors such as Huawei and ZTE. My friend Representative Kinzinger and I recently introduced the bipartisan bicameral Ensuring Network Security Act to expedite the replacement of all such equipment from our networks. Finally, in the 20 seconds that we have left, do you agree or disagree that we should do everything we can to replace such equipment as quickly as possible?
Well, yes, thank you, Congressman. And the commission recently finalized the designation of Huawei ZTE as covered companies posing a national security threat. And so I agree, we need to fund it now, but dozens of small carriers have bought this equipment. We need to do everything as quickly and thoroughly to make sure that we remove this, including as we start to rip and replace. I have forwarded the idea that we should have folks where U.S. taxpayer money, USF money as well, is potentially going to rip and replace. We need to have them consider ORAN providers.
Thank you. Gentlemen's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Ms. Clark for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this FCC oversight hearing today. And thank you to all of the commissioners for joining us virtually. Today, I wish I had the time to discuss issues such as how, in the midst of a pandemic, the FCC plans to address the homework gap and the status of communication networks in Puerto Rico. However, given time constraints, I'll go directly into my line of questioning. The census. As you know, the Trump administration is seeking to close out the US Census in a couple of weeks. This effort was recently blocked by a federal judge, but I'm very concerned about the effect of this shortened deadline in communities like mine, where only about half of the residents have responded so far. Many of these hard-to-count areas lack broadband access, falling on the wrong side of the digital divide. To illustrate, some of my constituents' only means to be connected is to utilize the Brooklyn Public Library's in-branch laptop loan program. However, some of the library system locations are still closed and have limited services due to the pandemic. Again, this is very concerning to me, knowing that we all need all hands on deck to be counted. Commissioner Rosenworcel, how would an incomplete census count impact the business case to bring connectivity to these areas or impact the FCC's work on connectivity more generally?
We have a constitutional duty to get an accurate count of everyone in this country. And so the problem is that when we have citizenship questions or we're trying to shut it down early, we're impeding our ability to get an accurate count. What I'm most worried about is that this is our nation's first digital census. And we know we've got a digital divide in this country. And if we are relying strictly on the internet, well, then we are going to leave people out. So it's never been more important that we figure out how to reach those people where they are, even though we have this public health crisis. We've hired 120,000 fewer people to actually work on the census this time around because we're relying on this internet first mode. But in districts like yours and elsewhere where the digital divide is rearing its head, we've got a problem. We've got to make sure that the census continues until we count everyone.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Last week, the full committee passed my bill, the Enhancing Broadcaster Diversity Data Act, out of the committee to the House floor. This bill was drafted due to the failure of the FCC to collect data to better understand the employment and ownership diversity numbers in the media industry for more than 20 years. It is troubling to know that some stakeholders do not want their demographic data public. Commissioner Starks, why do you believe it is important for this data to be collected? And how do you see my bill supporting the work of the FCC?
Well, thank you so much for your leadership. Proud to stand with you as always on this issue, Congresswoman. Representation matters, and workforce diversity in media is critical to ensure that all stories are told and that communities are served. America's broadcasters should look like America, and local media should reflect the local communities. And that stems from who's in front of the camera to who's in the C-suites to who is behind the production. And so third-party data is showing that people of color employed at television and radio broadcast stations has remained unacceptably low in my mind, particularly when we are talking about increasing diversity in so many ways. And so despite a statutory obligation to collect workforce diversity from broadcasters, this commission has failed to do so. We should have been collecting this on what is the Form 395B, which has been authorized by Congress, approved by OMB. And so we haven't focused on this and collected that data because of a dispute on confidentiality. I'm glad that your legislation will help us get where we need to be.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. And my final question, last week we witnessed another attempt by Donald Trump to utilize the FCC as his personal speech police due to the fact check on Twitter. This is the latest intimidation tactic by Donald Trump to try to dampen criticisms of him and his administration as carryovers from his May executive order. Moreover, today is the deadline for public comment on the Section 230 issue. So it's a timely conversation. Commissioner Starks, what are your thoughts on Trump's executive order and the next steps in the Section 230 conversation?
Well, thank you. This is absolutely critical. Again, like your first question about the census, this is integral to democracy. And so I know that you and many members of this committee are focused on this. There's a robust debate here in Congress about the future of Section 230. But let me be clear, we should reject the NTIA petition, especially when we consider the president's motives behind the EO. They're about retaliation, working the refs at a time when these decisions will impact the president's political future. And so we're an independent agency. We don't have to play this game, and we should get back to our focused work, which is helping to close internet inequality.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
And I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair sees Ms. Rogers, I believe, has waved on and is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate everything that the commission has done to help communities and emergency responders during wildfires out west. It's disappointing that this majority hasn't worked with us on any of the solutions that can restore communication networks in areas that have been hit. For instance, my Wireless Resiliency Act. I'd also hope this committee would follow this commission's lead in setting effective spectrum policy this Congress. Greater transparency for federal spectrum holdings is necessary for policyholders to make informed decisions so scarce spectrum resources are used in the best way possible. Earlier this week, I introduced the Government Spectrum Valuation Act with Congresswoman Clark to assess the commercial value of federal spectrum. While I had hoped to focus my questioning on this bipartisan effort, the majority today has made clear that they are dead set on continuing their pursuit for a government takeover of the internet. Chairman Pai, since the beginning of your tenure as FCC chair, the majority has warned of an internet apocalypse if Obama's FCC 2015 Title II regulatory order was reversed. They've said investment in speeds would decrease and access would suffer. Clearly, this hysteria is not based in fact. Had these concerns come to fruition, our networks would have collapsed under the huge increase in demand during this pandemic. In reality, our networks have held up and even thrived during this unprecedented increase in demand. Meanwhile, networks in Europe, where they've embraced the socialist internet policies the Democrats champion here in Congress, have buckled under the added pressure. Chairman Pai, do you believe that your restoring internet freedom order is part why the U.S. networks were able to handle the increased network traffic?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. There's no question with increased usage of 35%, up to 35% of fixed networks, up to 20% on mobile networks, a lot of people were wondering, would our networks be able to stand up? And they have. And part of the reason is because of the regulatory reforms that we took against vociferous opposition before anyone heard of coronavirus. The most notable being the Restoring Internet Freedom Order. I'm proud of the decision we took to get rid of those arcane utility-style regulations, and the results speak for themselves. Speeds are up over twice as what they were when we made the decision. Set records for fiber deployment in 2018 and 2019. Millions more Americans getting access to the internet than ever before. The price index, if you look at it, has gone down in terms of the affordability of prices. An independent study of urban rate survey data has shown that. And so, notwithstanding all the hot air and the absurd predictions we saw from politicians and lobbyists and the rest, the proof is in the pudding. The American consumer online today is better off because of our decision than they were prior to 2017.
Thank you, Chairman Pai. I'd like to close by addressing the renewed efforts to establish a nationalized 5G network. The idea a government-run network would be preferable to the networks within a free market is ill-advised. Likewise, the continued desire to impose utility-style regulations on the internet will impair our ability to deploy 5G and will only empower the Chinese Communist Party to beat us in this race for 5G. I've heard a lot of talk today from the majority about their desire for the US to lead in 5G. I hope we can put this talk into action by dropping the misguided push that will kill our ability to deploy next-gen networks. Free enterprise is central to America. It's produced the best telecommunications networks in the world, period. We have won the race to 5G. We've unleashed a decade of innovation and the app economy. And we will do the same with 5G by championing free markets and American ingenuity. We cannot beat the Chinese at their own game of central planning and government control, neither should we try. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yield. I would note that the only person that wants to nationalize 5G is the president. I think the rest of us agree with Ms. Rogers. The chair requests unanimous consent to enter the following into the record. A case study from ALA Policy Perspectives, correspondence between Representative Eshoo members and the FCC, a letter from 51 V2X stakeholders, comments by New America's Open Technology Institute and Ranking Digital Rights, a report from New America's Open Technology Institute, a letter from New America's Open Technology Institute, again, a letter from Americans for Tax Reform, a report from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a report from U.S. Telecom, a letter from Douglas County Commissioner Dave Layden to Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta, a letter from the minority listing Chairman Pai's accomplishments, and a letter from GE Healthcare Technologies. Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank all the witnesses for their participation today. It's good to see you all. I wish you all well. And I want to remind members that pursuant to committee rules that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the witnesses who have appeared. I ask each witness to respond promptly to any such questions you may receive. With that, this committee is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Take care.